Chapter 61. The next day Baron Danglars saw the Count of Monte Cristo's carriage enter his courtyard. He came out to meet the Count with a sad but affable expression on his face. "You've no doubt come to express your sympathy," he said. "Oh, be careful, Count. The men of our generation are unlucky this year. There's our puritanical public prosecutor, Monsieur de Villefort, who's losing his whole family in a strange manner. Then there's Monsieur de Morcerf, dishonored and dead. Then there's myself, covered with ridicule by that devilish Benedetto and what?" asked the Count. "Haven't you heard? A new misfortune? My daughter Eugenie has left us." "Impossible." "It's true, Count. She was crushed by the affront we received from that wretched scoundrel and asked me for permission to make a trip. She left night before last." "With Madame Danglars?" "No, with a relative. I'm afraid we've lost her, poor Eugenie. I know her character and I doubt that she'll ever consent to come back to France. Such sorrows would be unbearable for a man whose daughter was his only fortune," said Monte Cristo, "but they ought to be quite bearable for a millionaire. No matter what the philosophers say, money is always a great consolation. And you, the king of the world of finance, ought to have greater consolation than anyone else." Danglars cast a sidelong glance at Monte Cristo to see if he was joking or speaking seriously. "Yes," he said, "if fortune is a consolation I ought to be consoled. I'm rich. So rich, Baron, that your fortune is like the pyramids. If one should want to destroy them, one wouldn't dare. If one should dare, one wouldn't be able to." Danglars smiled and said, "That reminds me. I was signing some checks when you came in. Will you allow me to finish?" "Certainly." There was a moment during which the only sound to be heard was the scratching of the banker's pen. Then Danglars said to Monte Cristo, "Have you seen many scraps of paper like this, each one worth 1,000,000 francs?" Monte Cristo took the 5 scraps of paper which Danglars proudly handed to him and said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,000,000 francs. "That's how I do business," said Danglars. "It's wonderful, especially if the sum will be paid in cash, as I'm sure it will." "It will," said Danglars. "It's a fine thing to have such credit. Only in France could you see something like this. 5 scraps of paper worth 5,000,000 francs. It has to be seen to be believed. Do you doubt it? No. You don't sound very convinced. Why don't you see for yourself? Go with my clerk to the bank and you'll see him come out with a draft on the treasury for the same sum." "No," said Monte Cristo, folding the 5 checks, "the thing is so extraordinary that I'll make the experiment myself. My credit with you was 6,000,000 francs. I've drawn 900,000, so you still owe me 5,100,000. I'll take your 5 scraps of paper, which I trust to be valid from the sight of your signature alone, and here's a receipt for 6,000,000 francs, which settles our account. I made it out before I came here because I'm greatly in need of money today." Monte Cristo put the 5 checks into his pocket with one hand while he held out the receipt to Danglars with the other. Danglars was panic-stricken. "What? Are you taking those checks?" he stammered. "Excuse me, but I owe that money to the hospitals. It's a deposit I promised to repay this morning." "Ah, that's different," said Monte Cristo. "I'm not determined to have these 5 checks. You can give me another one. I took these only so I could say that, without 5 minutes' delay, the Danglars firm had paid me 5,000,000 francs on the spot. It would have been remarkable. But here are your checks. Give me another one." Danglars put out his hand to take the checks, but suddenly he appeared to change his mind and made a violent effort to control himself. Then he smiled and said, "After all, Count, your receipt is as good as cash. Of course, if you were in Rome, the firm of Thompson and French would pay you as easily as you've paid me. Shall I keep these checks, then?" "Yes, keep them. said Danglars, wiping away the perspiration that had broken out at the roots of his hair. Monte Cristo put the 5 checks into his pocket with an expression that said clearly, "Think it over. There's still time to change your mind." "No, no. Keep them," said Danglars. "You know how formalistic a banker is. I was going to give that money to the hospitals, and for a moment it seemed to me I'd be robbing them if I didn't give them those very same checks, as though 1 franc weren't the same as another. Excuse me, Count." And he burst into loud, nervous laughter. "I excuse you," said Monte Cristo graciously, "and I put your money into my pocket. But I still owe you 100,000 francs. "Oh, that's only a trifle. The convenience amounts to that much. Keep it and we'll consider our account settled." "Are you speaking seriously, Count?" "I never joke with bankers," said the Count with a seriousness that almost amounted to impertinence. As he was walking toward the door, a servant entered and announced, "Monsieur de Bouville, Commissioner of Hospitals." Danglars paled and hastened to take leave of Monte Cristo, who exchanged a ceremonious bow with Monsieur de Bouville as he passed through the waiting room. Outside he climbed into his carriage and drove straight to the bank. Meanwhile Danglars, restraining his emotions, greeted the Commissioner of Hospitals. It goes without saying that a courteous smile was stamped on his lips. "How are you today, dear creditor?" he asked. "Am I right in assuming that you've come to me as a creditor?" "You assume correctly, Baron," said Monsieur de Bouville. "Did you receive my letter yesterday?" "Yes." "Well, here's my receipt." "Monsieur de Bouville," said Danglars, "I'll have to ask you to wait till tomorrow in view of the fact that the Count of Monte Cristo, whom you saw in the waiting room, walked out of here with your 5 million francs." "What?" "The Count had an unlimited credit with me, a credit opened by the firm of Thompson and French, of Rome. He came to me today to ask me for 5 million francs all at once, so I gave him a check. As you can understand, I'm afraid the bank may find it a little strange if I withdraw 10 million francs in one day." "Do you mean to say," exclaimed Monsieur de Bouville in a tone of complete incredulity, "that you gave 5 million francs to that man who just left here and who bowed to me as though he knew me? Here's his receipt. See for yourself." Monsieur de Bouville took the receipt and read it with an expression of great admiration. "I must visit this man," he said, "and ask him for a donation to charity. I'll cite him the example of Madame de Morcerf and her son." "What about them?" "They gave their entire fortune to the hospitals." "What fortune?" "The fortune of the late General de Morcerf." "But why did they do that?" "They say they want nothing to do with money acquired in such an ignoble way." "How will they live, then?" "The mother is going to live in the provinces and the son has enlisted in the army, but let's come back to our 5 million francs. "Gladly," said Danglars in a perfectly natural tone. "Are you in a hurry to have the money?" "Of course. Our books are being examined tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Why, that's more than enough time." "What time is the examination?" "At 2 o'clock." "Send someone here at noon." Monsieur de Bouville nodded reluctantly and fingered his portfolio. "Just a moment," said Danglars, "I have a better idea. The Count of Monte Cristo's receipt is the same as money. Take it to Rothschild or Lafitte and they'll accept it on sight." "Even though it's payable in Rome?" "Certainly. Of course, it will cost you a discount of 5 or 6,000 francs." "Then I'd rather wait till tomorrow." "What strange ideas you have!" "Very well, then, I'll pay you tomorrow." "And I'll have the money without fail?" "Of course." "Why, you must be joking." "Send someone here tomorrow and the bank will be notified." "I'll come in person." "So much the better. That will give me the pleasure of seeing you again." They shook hands. "By the way," said Monsieur de Bouville, "aren't you going to poor Mademoiselle de Villefort's funeral? I passed the procession on my way here." "No, I still feel a little ridiculous after that Benedetto affair, and I want to stay out of sight as much as possible for a while. You may be sure everyone sympathizes with you, and especially with your daughter." "Poor Eugenie," said Danglars with a deep sigh. "Have you heard that she's going to enter a convent?" "No. Alas, it's only too true. The day after the disaster, she decided to leave with a friend of hers who's already a nun. She's going to find some very severe convent in Italy or Spain." "Oh, that's terrible." Monsieur de Beauville withdrew, expressing his deepest sympathy as he left. But as soon as he was gone, Danglars exclaimed vehemently, "Idiot! I'll be far away from here when you come tomorrow." Then he locked the door, collected 50,000 francs or so in cash from a drawer, burned certain papers, placed others in evidence, and wrote a letter, whose only address was, "To Madame Danglars." He took out his passport from the drawer, looked at it and said, "Good, it's valid for 2 more months." Chapter 62. Monsieur de Beauville had, as he said, passed the funeral procession that was taking Valentine to her final resting place. A true Parisian, Monsieur de Villefort regarded the Père Lachaise cemetery as the only one worthy of receiving the mortal remains of a Parisian family. Only there could a well-bred corpse feel at home. He had therefore bought a vault there and had the words, "Saint Miran and Villefort" inscribed on it. Such had been the dying wish of poor Renée, Valentine's mother. The procession was composed predominantly of young people who had been struck by Valentine's death as though by a thunderbolt, and who, despite the cold and prosaic tenor of the times, were deeply affected by the thought of the death of such a beautiful, chaste and adorable girl, cut off in the flower of her youth. As the procession was approaching the outskirts of Paris, it was overtaken by a carriage drawn by 4 swift horses. The Count of Monte Cristo climbed out of the carriage and mingled with the crowd, following the hearse on foot. Chateau Renaud and Beauchamp soon noticed him and came up beside him. "Have you seen Maximilien Morrel?" asked the Count. "No," replied Chateau Renaud. "We were wondering about him when the procession began because none of us saw him." The Count said nothing, but he continued to look around him. However, he did not find what he was looking for until the procession reached the cemetery. There he saw Maximilien standing beside a tree on top of a hillock overlooking the vault. The Count watched him all through the ceremony. "Look, there's Maximilien Morrel," said Beauchamp to Debray suddenly. "What's he doing up there?" "See how pale he is," said Chateau Renaud. "He's cold," said Debray. "No, I think he's agitated," replied Chateau Renaud slowly. "He's a very emotional man. Why, he hardly knew Mademoiselle de Villefort." "That's true. But I remember seeing him dance 3 times with her at a ball once." "The ceremony is over," said Monte Cristo abruptly. "Goodbye, gentlemen." And he walked off as the rest of the crowd began to prepare for the trip back to town. Monte Cristo hid himself behind a tombstone and watched Maximilien's movements. The young man slowly approached the vault, which was now abandoned, and knelt before it. Then he pressed his forehead against the stone and murmured, "Oh, Valentine." The Count's heart was deeply affected by the way these words were uttered. He stepped forward, touched Maximilien on the shoulder and said, "I was looking for you, my friend." He expected an outburst of reproach or recrimination, but he was mistaken. Maximilien turned around and said, with apparent calm, "I was praying." The Count looked at him searchingly for a time, after which he seemed to feel more reassured. "Would you like me to take you back to town?" he asked. "No, thank you. Is there anything I can do for you?" "Let me pray." The Count walked off without saying anything further, but he took up another post of observation from which he watched Maximilien's every move. The young man finally stood up and began to walk back to town. Monte Cristo dismissed his carriage, which had been waiting for him, and walked after him, following him from 100 paces behind. 5 minutes after the door of the house in the Rue Meslay closed behind Maximilien, it opened for Monte Cristo. Julie was in the garden attentively watching Penelon, who took his profession of gardener seriously, at work on some rose bushes. "Ah, the Count of Monte Cristo!" she exclaimed with the joy which each member of the family always manifested when the Count paid a visit. "Maximilian just came home, didn't he?" asked Monte Cristo. "Yes, I think I saw him go past," replied the young woman. "Excuse me, but I must see him immediately. I have something extremely important to tell him." "Go right on up, then," said Julie. She watched him with her charming smile until he had disappeared up the staircase. When Monte Cristo arrived in front of Maximilian's room on the third floor, he stopped and listened. There was no sound. The door had a glass panel, but it was impossible to see through it because it was covered by a red curtain hung on the inside. The Count reflected for a moment. "Shall I ring?" he thought. No, the sound of a doorbell often hastens the resolution of one in Maximilian's situation, and another sound answers the sound of the bell. He shuddered from head to foot. Then, making a decision with his usual swiftness, he broke the glass panel with his elbow, pushed aside the curtain and saw Maximilian at his desk with a pen in his hand. He had started up from his chair at the sound of the breaking glass. "Excuse me," said the Count. "I slipped and my elbow went through the glass. But since it's broken, I'll take advantage of it to open the door. Don't bother to get up." He put his arm through the hole, unlocked the door and opened it. Maximilian, clearly annoyed, stepped forward, less in order to receive the Count than to block his way. "It's your servant's fault," said the Count, rubbing his elbow. "Your floors are as shiny as mirrors." "Did you hurt yourself?" asked Maximilian coldly. "I don't know. Were you writing just now?" "Yes. Even a soldier writes now and then." Monte Cristo stepped further into the room. Maximilian had to let him pass, but he followed him. The Count cast a glance around the room. "What are your pistols doing there?" he asked, pointing to the weapons lying on the desk. "I'm about to go on a journey," replied Maximilian. "Maximilian," said Monte Cristo, "let's take off the masks we're both wearing. You don't deceive me with your artificial calmness any more than I deceive you with my frivolous solicitude. I'm sure you realize that in order to have broken into a friend's room I must have been moved by genuine apprehension, or, rather, a terrible conviction. Maximilian, you want to kill yourself." Maximilian started and said, "Where did you get such an idea, Count?" "I repeat that you want to kill yourself," replied the Count, "and here's the proof." He walked over to the desk, raised the sheet of paper the young man had placed over the letter he had begun and picked up the letter. Maximilian rushed forward to snatch it out of his hand, but the Count seized him by the wrist in a grip of steel. "What if I am going to kill myself?" cried Maximilian, abandoning his pretense of calm. "Who will have the courage to prevent me? When I say, all my hopes are ruined, my heart is broken, my life is ended and there's nothing around me but mourning and dismay, who will answer, 'You were wrong'? Would you have the courage to say that, Count?" "Yes, I would," replied the Count in a tone whose calmness contrasted strangely with the young man's violence. "You!" cried Maximilian in growing anger and reproach. "You lured me on with absurd hopes, you lulled me with vain promises when, by some desperate action, I could have either saved her or at least seen her die in my arms. You pretend to play the part of Providence and you don't even have the power to give an antidote to a girl who's been poisoned. Maximilian, you told me to take off my mask and that's just what I'm doing. When you followed me to the cemetery I spoke to you courteously because I have a good heart, but since you've come here to interfere with me in the room that's about to become my tomb, since you've brought me a new torture when I thought I'd exhausted them all, you're about to watch your friend die." Maximilian reached for his pistols again with an insane laugh, but Monte Cristo, his eyes flashing fire, stopped him once more and said, "Maximilian, you will not kill yourself." try to stop me, then," cried Maximilian, still struggling to reach his pistols, but still powerless in the Count's merciless grip. "I will stop you. Who are you to behave so tyrannically toward a man who's free to make his own decisions? Who am I? Listen and I'll tell you. I am the only man in the world who has the right to say to you, Maximilian, I won't allow your father's son to die today." "Why do you speak of my father?" stammered Maximilian. "Why do you mingle his memory with what's happening to me today?" "Because I'm the man who saved your father's life one day when he wanted to kill himself just as you want to kill yourself today. Because I'm the man who sent the purse to your sister and the pharaon to your father. Because I'm Edmond Dantes, who used to play with you on my knees when you were a child." Maximilian staggered back, overwhelmed. His strength abandoned him and he fell to the floor. Then suddenly, completely regenerated, he leaped to his feet and rushed out into the hall, shouting, "Julie! Julie! Emmanuel! Emmanuel!" Monte Cristo tried to come after him, but Maximilian closed the door and would have died before he let the Count open it. Julie and Emmanuel ran upstairs in answer to Maximilian's cries. He took them by the hand, opened the door and said, in a voice choked with emotion, "On your knees. This is our benefactor, the man who saved our father's life. This is—" he was going to say, "This is Edmond Dantes," but the Count stopped him by gripping his arm. Julie clutched the Count's hand, Emmanuel embraced him as though he were a tutelary god, and Maximilian once again fell to his knees. At that moment the man of bronze felt his heart swell in his chest and a flame seemed to dart from his throat to his eyes. He bowed his head and wept. When she had recovered a little from her first emotion, Julie ran out of the room, down the stairs and into the salon, where, with childish joy, she lifted the crystal globe protecting the purse that had been given to her by the stranger of the alleys de Milan. Meanwhile Emmanuel was saying to the Count, "Oh, Count, you heard us speak of our unknown benefactor, you saw with what gratitude and adoration we surrounded his memory. Why did you wait so long to reveal yourself?" "My friend," replied the Count, "the discovery of this secret was brought on by a great event which must remain unknown to you. God is my witness that I wanted to keep it buried in my own soul for the rest of my life, but Maximilian has torn it from me by a violence which I'm sure he regrets now." Seeing that Maximilian had sunk into a chair on the other side of the room, Monte Cristo added in a low voice, "Watch over him." "Why?" asked Emmanuel in surprise. "I can't tell you why. But watch over him." Emmanuel looked around the room and perceived Maximilian's pistols. He stared at them in alarm and slowly pointed to them. The Count nodded. Emmanuel made a movement toward the pistols, but the Count said, "Leave them alone." Then he went over to Maximilian and took his hand. The tumultuous emotions which had shaken the young man's heart had now given way to a dazed torpor. Julie entered the room holding the silken purse in her hand as two glistening tears of joy rolled down her cheeks. "Here's the relic," she said. "Don't think it's any less dear to me now that the Savior has revealed himself." "Let me take back that purse," said Monte Cristo, blushing. "Since you now know my face, I want to be remembered only by the affection which I beg you to grant me." "Oh, no!" exclaimed Julie, pressing the purse to her heart. "Please don't take it back. I'm afraid you'll leave us someday." "You've guessed correctly," replied Monte Cristo, smiling. "Within a week I'll have left this country where so many people who deserved the vengeance of heaven were living in happiness, while my father had died of hunger and grief." As he said this, Monte Cristo kept his eyes fixed on Maximilian, and he noticed that the words, "I'll have left this country," passed without drawing the young man from his lethargy. Taking Julie and Emmanuel by the hand, he said to them with the gentle authority of a father, "Please leave me alone with Maximilian now." Julie saw her chance to take away the precious relic which the Count had forgotten to mention again. She hurriedly pulled her husband out of the room, leaving Monte Cristo alone with Maximilian, who continued to remain as motionless as a statue. "Maximilian," said Monte Cristo, touching him with his finger, "are you ready to become a man again?" "Yes. I'm beginning to suffer again." The Count frowned. "Maximilian," he said, "you're giving in to ideas that are unworthy of a Christian." "Oh, don't worry, my friend," said Maximilian, raising his face and showing the Count a smile permeated with unspeakable sadness. "I won't seek out death now. No, I have something better than a pistol secure me of my grief. My grief itself will kill me." "My friend," said Monte Cristo in a tone of melancholy equal to Maximilian's, "listen to me. One day, in a moment of despair, I too wanted to kill myself. One day your father, equally desperate, also wanted to kill himself. If, at that supreme moment, when your father was pointing the pistol at his forehead, or when I was pushing away the food I hadn't touched for 3 days, someone had said to both of us, 'Live, for a day will come when you will be happy and bless life,' we would both have listened to those words with a smile of doubt or with the anguish of incredulity. And yet how often did your father later bless life, how often have I myself?" "You only lost your liberty," interrupted Maximilian, "and my father only lost his fortune, but I've lost Valentine." "Look at me, Maximilian," said Monte Cristo with that solemnity which, on certain occasions, made him so commanding and persuasive. "There are no tears in my eyes, my heart is not throbbing painfully, and there is no fever in my veins, and yet I'm now watching you suffer, you whom I love as though you were my son. Doesn't that tell you that suffering is like life, that there is always something unknown beyond it? If I beg you, if I order you to live, Maximilian, it's because I'm convinced that someday you'll thank me for having preserved your life for you." "Oh, my God, Count!" cried the young man. "What are you saying? Haven't you ever been in love?" "Child," replied the Count. "I'm speaking of real love," continued Maximilian. "I've been a soldier ever since I became a man. I lived to the age of 29 without ever being in love, for nothing I felt till then deserves the name of love. Then I found Valentine, and I've been in love with her for 2 years. With Valentine, Count, my happiness was infinite, unheard of, a happiness too great, too complete, too divine for this world. And now that she's gone, there's nothing left for me but heartbreak and despair. I have told you to hope, Maximilian. Be careful, Count. You're trying to persuade me, and if you do, you'll make me lose my reason, for you'll make me believe I'll see Valentine again." The Count smiled. "Let me tell you again to be careful," said Maximilian excitedly. "The ascendancy you have over me frightens me. Be careful of what you say, or you'll make me believe in supernatural things." "Hope, my friend," repeated the Count. "Oh, you're only playing with me," said Maximilian, falling from the heights of exaltation into the depths of despair. "You're only acting like those kind mothers, or rather, those selfish mothers, who soothe their children's sorrow with sweet words because their crying is tiresome. No, I was wrong to tell you to be careful. Don't worry. I'll bury my grief deep inside me and I'll make it so secret and obscure that you won't even have to take the trouble to sympathize with me. Goodbye, my friend." "No, Maximilian, it's not goodbye. From now on you're going to live with me without leaving my side, and within a week we'll have left France behind us. And you still tell me to hope?" "Yes, because I know a way to cure you." "Count, you make me even sadder, if such a thing is possible. You see only commonplace grief as the result of the blow I've suffered, and you think you can console me with a commonplace remedy, travel." And Maximilian shook his head in disdainful incredulity. "I have faith in my own promises," said Monte Cristo. "Let me make the experiment." "You're only prolonging my agony. Is your heart so weak that you can't give your friend a few days to prove his promise? Do you know what the Count of Monte Cristo is capable of doing? Do you know that he has a great deal of worldly power at his command? Do you know that he has enough faith in God to obtain miracles from him who said that with faith a man could move mountains? I tell you to wait for this miracle or else I'll call you an ingrate. Have pity on me, Count. Listen to me, Maximilian. I have so much pity on you that if I haven't cured you of your grief within 1 month from now, to the day and to the hour, I myself will place you before these pistols and before a cup of the deadliest poison of Italy, a much quicker and deadlier poison than the one that killed Valentine. Will you promise me that? I not only promise it, I swear it, said the Count, taking Maximilian's hand. In a month, on your word of honor, if I'm still not consoled, you'll leave me free to dispose of my life as I see fit, and no matter what I do you won't call me ungrateful? In exactly 1 month, and the date is sacred. I don't know if it's occurred to you that today is the 5th of September. It was 10 years ago today that I saved your father's life when he wanted to die. Maximilian seized the Count's hands and kissed them. The Count allowed him to do so, as though he realized that this adoration was his due. A month from today, continued Monte Cristo, we will both be seated at a table on which there will be good weapons and gentle poison. But in return will you promise to go on living till then? I swear it. Monte Cristo pressed the young man to his heart and held him there for a long time. And now, he said, you will come to live with me. You may take Hattie's rooms. Hattie? What's happened to her? She left last night. She's now waiting for me to join her. Make ready to come to live in my house on the Champs-Élysées, but first lead me out of here without anyone seeing me leave. Maximilian bowed his head and obeyed like a child, or like a disciple. Chapter 63. In the hotel in the Rue Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which Albert de Morcerf had chosen for himself and his mother, the second floor, composed of a small apartment, was rented to a very mysterious personage, a man whose face had never been seen when he entered or left the hotel, even by the concierge, for in winter he buried his face in a large red scarf and in summer he always blew his nose just as he was passing the concierge's window. His visits were usually quite regular. It was nearly always toward 4 o'clock that he took possession of his apartment, in which he never spent the night. 20 minutes after his arrival, a carriage would stop in front of the hotel and a woman, dressed in either black or dark blue but always wrapped in a flowing veil, would alight, pass before the concierge's window like a shadow and mount the stairs without causing a single step to creak under her light footsteps. She was never asked where she was going. Her face was therefore also completely unknown to the two concierges, perhaps the only members of the vast brotherhood of Paris concierges who were capable of such discretion. It goes without saying that the woman never went any higher than the second floor. There she would scratch on the door in a certain way. It would then be opened to her and closed tightly behind her. The same maneuvers were employed for leaving the hotel. The woman, always veiled, would leave first, climb into her carriage and drive off, sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another. 20 minutes later the man, his face sunk down into a scarf or hidden by a handkerchief, would come out and also disappear. The day after the Count of Monte Cristo paid his visit to Baron Danglars, the day of Valentine's funeral, the mysterious tenant arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning instead of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Shortly afterward, without maintaining the customary interval, a carriage drew up and the veiled lady ran up the stairs. The door opened and closed behind her, but before it had closed she cried out, "Oh, Lucien!" The concierge involuntarily overheard this exclamation and learned for the first time that his tenant's name was Lucien, but, being a model concierge, he promised himself he would not tell his wife. "What's the matter?" asked the man whose name had been revealed through the veiled lady's anxiety and agitation. "Can I count on you?" "Of course you can. You know that. But tell me what's the matter. Your note this morning frightened me." "Lucien, my husband left last night." "Left? Monsieur Danglars has left? Where did he go? I don't know. Do you mean to say he's left for good? I think so. He left me a letter. Here. Read it. Madame Danglars drew out an unsealed letter and handed it to Debray. He took it and read the salutation, "My dear and very faithful wife." He stopped unconsciously and looked at Madame Danglars, who blushed to the roots of her hair. "Read," she said. He looked back at the letter and read the following: "When you read this letter, you will no longer have a husband. Oh, don't alarm yourself too violently. You will no longer have a husband in the same sense that you no longer have a daughter. In other words, I will be on one of the 30 or 40 roads that lead out of France. I owe you an explanation, and you are just the woman to understand it perfectly. I was asked for a payment of 5 million francs this morning and I made it, but it was followed almost immediately by another request for the same sum, which I postponed until tomorrow. I am leaving today in order to avoid that tomorrow which would be unbearably disagreeable to me. You can understand that, can't you, my darling wife? You can understand it because you know as much about my affairs as I do. In fact, you know more about them than I do, because if someone were to ask me to tell what had happened to a good half of my fortune, which was once considerable, I would be unable to reply, while I am sure that you would be able to give a very good answer. Have you ever admired the swiftness of my fall, madam? Have you ever been a little dazzled by that sudden melting away of all my gold? As for myself, I admit that I am completely baffled. I hope only that you have been able to find a little gold in the ashes. It is with this consoling hope that I leave you, my dear and very prudent wife, without having the slightest scruple about abandoning you. You still have certain friends, the ashes I mentioned above and, best of all, the freedom which I hasten to give you. And now allow me to add a more personal explanation. As long as I believed you to be working for the welfare of our family and the fortune of our daughter, I philosophically closed my eyes. But now that you have brought our family to utter ruin, I refuse to serve as the foundation of someone else's fortune. You were rich but little respected when I married you. Excuse me for speaking so frankly, but since you will probably be the only one to read this, I see no reason why I should mince words. I increased our fortune, which grew steadily for 15 years until a series of disasters, still incomprehensible to me, destroyed it through no fault of my own. You, on the other hand, worked only to increase your own fortune, and I am convinced that you have succeeded quite well. I leave you, therefore, as I found you, with considerable wealth but little honor. From now on I am also going to work only for myself. Please accept my gratitude for the example you have set for me. Your devoted husband, Baron Danglars. Madame Danglars watched Debray as he read this long and painful letter. Once or twice she saw him change color, despite his well-known self-control. He carefully folded the letter when he had finished reading it and remained thoughtfully silent. "Well?" asked Madame Danglars with an anxiety that was easy to understand. "Well?" repeated Debray absently. "What ideas does the letter inspire in you?" "It's quite simple. It inspires in me the idea that your husband left with certain suspicions in his mind. Of course. But is that all you have to say to me?" "I don't understand," said Debray coldly. "He's gone. Gone for good. He'll never come back." "Oh, don't think that," said Debray. "No, he won't come back. I know him. He's inflexible where his own interest is concerned. If he'd thought I might be useful to him, he'd have taken me with him, but he's left me behind in Paris, which means that our separation will further his plans. It's therefore irrevocable and I'm free forever," added Madame Danglars with a supplicating expression. But Debray left her in that attitude of anxious interrogation without answering her. "Have you nothing to say?" she asked finally. "I have only a question to ask you. What are you going to do?" "I was going to ask you that," said Madame Danglars, her heart pounding. You want to ask me for advice? That's right. I want to ask you for advice, replied Madame Danglars, her heart sinking. Since you've asked me, replied Debray coldly, I advise you to travel. Travel, murmured Madame Danglars. Certainly. As your husband says, you're rich and perfectly free, and it seems to me an absence from Paris will be absolutely necessary to you after the double scandal of your daughter's broken engagement and your husband's disappearance. You must make sure that everyone knows you've been abandoned and believes you to be poor. Remain in Paris for 2 more weeks and tell all your friends how you've been abandoned. They'll repeat it to everyone else. Then leave your house, leaving your jewels behind, and everyone will sing your praises. People will then know you've been abandoned and will believe you to be poor, for I alone know your financial situation and I'm ready to settle accounts with you as an honorable partner. Madame Danglars listened to these words with a horror and despair equal to Debray's calm and indifference. Abandoned, she repeated. Oh, yes, I'm abandoned. No one can doubt that. This was all that the Baroness, proud and still deeply infatuated, could reply to Debray. But you're rich, very rich, in fact, continued Debray, taking a number of papers from his portfolio and spreading them out on the table. Madame Danglars was absorbed in stifling the pounding of her heart and holding back the tears she felt welling up in her eyes. Finally her sense of dignity won out and, while she failed to still the beating of her heart, she managed not to shed a single tear. We've been partners now for 6 months, said Debray. You furnished an initial capital of 100,000 francs. We formed our partnership in April and began our operations in May. In May we made 450,000 francs. In June our profits went up to 9,000. In July we added 1,700,000 francs. That was the month of the Spanish bonds. At the beginning of August we lost 300,000 francs, but on the 15th we made up for it. Our accounts, from the beginning of our partnership till yesterday, show a profit of 2,400,000 francs, which makes 1,200,000 francs for each of us. Your money is here now. Since I didn't consider my house safe enough or any notary discreet enough, I've kept the entire sum sealed in a coffer beneath this closet. I acted as my own mason for greater security. Now, continued Debray, opening first the closet and then the coffer, here are 800 banknotes of 1,000 francs each, and here's a sight draft on my banker for the remainder. Since my banker isn't Monsieur Danglars, you can be sure the draft will be paid. Spread out on a table, that enormous fortune appeared rather unimpressive. Madame Danglars, her eyes dry but her chest swollen with sobs, picked it up and stood silently waiting for a kind word to console her for being so rich. But she waited in vain. Now, said Debray, you'll have an income of something like 60,000 francs a year, which is enormous for a woman who won't be able to maintain a household for at least another year. It will enable you to carry out any whim that may occur to you. Madame Danglars raised her head, opened the door and, without any show of anger but also without any hesitation, hurried down the stairs, scorning even to say goodbye to the man who allowed her to leave in that manner. Debray picked up his account book and carefully crossed out the sums he had just paid. Then he phlegmatically waited the customary 20 minutes before leaving. Above the room in which Debray had just divided 2.5 million francs with Madame Danglars, there was another room rented by 2 other people with whom we are acquainted, Mercedes and her son Albert. Mercedes had changed greatly in the past few days. Her eyes no longer sparkled, her lips no longer smiled, and a constant confusion checked the words that had formerly flowed so rapidly at the prompting of her ready wit. It was not poverty that had broken her spirit, nor was it lack of courage that made her poverty burdensome, although it is true that she saw nothing but depressing objects around her. The walls of her room were covered with that gray wallpaper chosen by thrifty landlords because it does not show dirt easily. There was no rug on the floor. The furniture fairly cried out for attention to its shoddy attempt at luxury. In short, Everything about the room was painful to eyes accustomed to harmonious elegance. As for Albert, he was ill at ease, embarrassed by a last remainder of luxury which prevented him from adjusting himself to his present condition. He went out without gloves, but found that his hands were too white. He went through the streets on foot, but found that his boots were too shiny. "Mother," said Albert at exactly the moment when Madame Danglars was descending the stairs, "let's count all our wealth. I need to know the total in order to make my plans." "Total, zero," said Mercedes with a sad smile. "Not at all, mother. The total is 3,000 francs, and I maintain that we can both live quite well with that much." "Child," sighed Mercedes. "Why, 3,000 francs is an enormous sum. I've already planned a miraculous future of eternal security with it. First of all, shall we accept that 3,000 francs?" asked Mercedes, blushing. "I thought we'd already agreed on that," replied Albert firmly. "We'll accept it, especially since it's still buried in a garden in Marseille. We have enough money for both of us to make the trip to Marseille. I sold my watch for 100 francs, but that's not all. What do you think of this, mother?" And Albert took out a banknote of 1,000 francs. "Where did that come from?" asked Mercedes. "Listen to me, mother, and try not to be too upset. I enlisted in the Spas yesterday. I realized that at least my body was my own, so yesterday I sold myself as a replacement. And I got more than I thought I was worth," added the young man, trying to smile. "I'll be paid 2,000 francs. So this 1,000 francs, that's half the amount, mother. I'll have the other half in a year." 2 tears streamed silently down Mercedes' cheeks. "The price of his blood," she murmured. "If I'm killed, yes," said Albert, laughing. "But I can assure you I intend to defend myself as ferociously as I can. I've never had a stronger desire to live than I have now. And besides, think how happy you'll be when you see me in my handsome uniform. I admit I chose the Spahi regiment out of sheer vanity." Mercedes tried to smile. "And now, mother," continued Albert, "you're assured of over 4,000 francs. With it you can live for at least 2 years." "Do you think so?" said Mercedes. The words escaped from her with such genuine grief that Albert realized their true meaning, and he felt his heart sink. Taking his mother's hand and pressing it tenderly, he said, "Yes, you'll live." "I'll live," cried Mercedes. "But you won't leave me, will you, my son?" "Mother," said Albert firmly, "you love me too much to want me to stay with you idle and useless. Besides, I've already signed my enlistment papers. Act according to your own will, my son, and I'll act according to God's." "I'm not acting according to my will, mother, but according to reason and necessity. We're both in a desperate situation, aren't we? What is life for us at this moment? Nothing. And what is life for me without you, mother? I swear to you that, if it weren't for you, my life would have ceased the day I rejected my father's name. But I'll live if you'll promise me to hope. If you'll place your future happiness in my hands, you'll double my strength. After I've joined my regiment in Africa, I'll go to see the governor of Algeria. I'll tell him my sad story and ask him to keep an eye on me from time to time. If he watches me in action, within 6 months I'll be either an officer or dead. If I become an officer, your life is assured, mother, because I'll have money enough for both of us and a new name that we'll both be proud of, since it will be your real name. And if I'm killed, well, mother, you can die if you like, and then our misfortune will have come to an end through its own excess." "Very well," replied Mercedes with a noble and eloquent look. "You're right, my son. Let's prove that we're at least worthy of being pitied. You can leave for Marseille this very day, mother. I've already made all the arrangements for your trip." "But what about you, Albert?" "I have to stay in Paris for another 2 or 3 days. I need certain recommendations and certain information about Africa." I'll rejoin you in Marseille. So be it. Then, let's leave, said Mercedes, wrapping herself in the only shawl she had taken with her. Albert hastily collected his papers, rang to pay the 30 francs he owed to the hotel keeper and, offering his arm to his mother, began to descend the stairs. A man was walking down ahead of them. Hearing a rustle of a silken dress, he turned around. "Debray!" exclaimed Albert. "You, Morcerf," replied the minister's secretary, stopping short. His curiosity proved stronger than his desire to remain incognito. Besides, he had already been recognized. Then, in the semi-darkness, he noticed the still young figure and the black veil of Albert's companion and said, with a smile, "Oh, excuse me, Albert. I'll leave you alone." Albert understood Debray's thought. "Mother," he said, turning to Mercedes, "this is Monsieur Debray, secretary to the Minister of the Interior and a former friend of mine." "What do you mean by former?" stammered Debray. "I say that because today I no longer have any friends, and I must not have any. I thank you for being kind enough to recognize me." Debray shook Albert's hand energetically and said, "Believe me, Albert, when I tell you how deeply I sympathize with you in your misfortune and how glad I'll be to help you in any way I can." "Thank you," said Albert, smiling, "but in the midst of all our misfortune we've remained rich enough not to have to go to anyone for help. We're leaving Paris with 5,000 francs over and above our traveling expenses." Debray's precise mind was little inclined to poetic comparisons, but he could not help reflecting that the same hotel had just held two women, one of whom, rightly dishonored, had just left poor with 1.5 million francs, while the other, unjustly persecuted by fate but sublime in her misfortune, considered herself rich with a few sous. The parallel disturbed him so much that he forgot his usual politeness. He murmured a few words of general civility and rapidly walked down the stairs. That day his subordinates at the ministry had to put up with a great deal because of his bad humor. But that evening he made himself the owner of a fine house, located on the Boulevard de la Madeleine and bringing in an income of 50,000 francs a year. As he was signing the deed, toward 5 o'clock in the evening, Mercedes, after tenderly kissing her son and being tenderly kissed by him, climbed into a stagecoach and departed. A man watched her departure from a hidden vantage point. Passing his hand over his forehead, he said to himself, "How can I give back the happiness I've taken away from those two innocent creatures? God will help me." Chapter 64. One section of the prison of La Force, the one in which the most dangerous prisoners are kept, is called the Court of St. Bernard, but the prisoners, in their vivid language, have named it the Lion's Den, probably because its inmates have teeth which often bite the bars and sometimes the guards. It is a prison within a prison. The walls here are twice as thick as in the other sections. Every day a jailer carefully tests the soundness of the massive iron bars on the windows. The Herculean stature and cold, penetrating eyes of the guards here show that they have been specially selected to rule over their charges by terror and shrewdness. The courtyard of this section of the prison is enclosed by enormous walls, over which the sun shines obliquely when it decides to penetrate into that abyss of moral and physical horrors. There, from morning till night, wander the men whom justice holds bowed beneath the guillotine which she is sharpening. As he walked in this courtyard with his hands in the pockets of his coat, one young man was looked at with particular curiosity by the other inhabitants of the Lion's Den. His clothes would have marked him as an elegant young man if they had not been in tatters. They were not worn out, however. The cloth, fine and silky in the parts that still remained intact, easily regained its luster under the prisoner's caressing hand. He bestowed the same care on a cambric shirt, which had changed color considerably since his entrance into prison, and he polished his patent leather boots with the corner of a handkerchief embroidered with initials surmounted by a coronet. Suddenly a voice called out from the wicket, "Benedetto!" "Are you calling me?" asked the prisoner. "To the visiting room." replied the voice. Andrea was surprised, for, unlike most prisoners, the crafty young man had not availed himself of the privilege of writing letters to ask for visitors. "I'm obviously under the protection of someone powerful," he said to himself. "Everything proves it to me. My sudden fortune, the ease with which I've overcome all obstacles, my improvised family, my new title and the opportunity to marry into a rich family. My protector has neglected me temporarily, but his neglect won't last. Why should I do anything rash? I might alienate my protector. There are two ways he can save me: arrange a mysterious escape by bribery, or somehow force my judges to declare me innocent. I won't do anything on my own unless I find out I've been completely abandoned." But then, Andrea had devised a fairly clever plan. The treacherous young man was bold in attack and tenacious in defense. He had already borne up under the rigors of prison and all its hardships. Little by little, however, nature, or rather habit, began to overcome his resolution. He began to suffer from being thinly clad, dirty and hungry. Time began to hang heavily on his hands. It was at this moment of dejection that he was called to the visiting room. His heart leaped with joy. He was led into a room divided in half by an iron grille, behind which he saw the somber and intelligent face of Monsieur Bertuccio. "Hello, Benedetto," said Bertuccio in his deep, sonorous voice. "You!" cried the young man, casting a frightened glance around the room. "Don't you recognize me, Benedetto?" "Not so loud," said Andrea, who was aware that those walls had ears. "You'd prefer to speak with me in complete privacy, wouldn't you?" asked Bertuccio. "Yes." Bertuccio took something from his pocket and motioned to a guard who could be seen through the barred window. "Read this," he said. "What is it?" asked Andrea. "An order to let you have a room of your own and to let me speak with you there." "Oh!" exclaimed Andrea joyfully. And immediately he said to himself, "Still the unknown protector. He hasn't forgotten me." Bertuccio was sent by him. The guard conferred for a moment with a superior, then led Andrea to a room on the second floor overlooking the courtyard. The walls of the room were whitewashed, as is the custom in prisons. To Andrea it had an appearance of almost dazzling charm. A stove, a bed, a chair and a table composed its sumptuous furnishings. Bertuccio sat down on the chair, Andrea stretched out on the bed and the guard withdrew. "Well, what do you have to say to me?" asked Bertuccio. "What about you?" "You first." "Oh, no. You're the one who has things to tell me, since it was you who came to see me." "All right, then. You've continued your criminal ways. You've stolen and murdered. If the only reason you had me put into a private room was so you could tell me that," said Andrea, "you might as well have saved yourself the trouble. I know all that. But there are other things I don't know, so let's talk about them if you don't mind. First of all, who sent you?" "Oh, you're going very fast, Monsieur Benedetto." "That's right. And straight to the point. Let's not waste words. Who sent you?" "No one." "How did you know I was in prison?" "I recognized you long ago as the insolent young fop driving along the Champs-Élysées." "The Champs-Élysées? That brings us closer to the point. Tell me about my father." "Who do you suppose I am, then?" "You, my good man, are my stepfather. But I don't think it was you who provided me with 100,000 francs, which I spent in 4 or 5 months. It wasn't you who fabricated a noble Italian father for me. It wasn't you who introduced me into the cream of Paris society at a magnificent dinner party in Auteuil, and you certainly weren't the one who was backing me with 2 million francs when the cat was accidentally let out of the bag. What do you want me to tell you?" asked Bertuccio. "I'll give you a hint. You mentioned the Champs-Élysées just now. Well, a certain very rich gentleman lives on the Champs-Élysées." "A gentleman in whose house you committed murder and robbery?" "Yes, I believe so. You're speaking of the Count of Monte Cristo, aren't you? That's right. Now tell me, must I throw myself in his arms, press him to my heart and cry out, "Father! Father!" "Let's not joke," replied Bertuccio gravely, "and don't ever say such a thing again." "Why not?" asked Andrea, somewhat taken aback by Bertuccio's solemnity. "Because the Count of Monte Cristo is too highly favored by heaven to be the father of a wretched criminal like you. Those are fine words, but there will be more than words if you're not careful. Threats. I'm not afraid. I'll tell." "Do you think you're dealing with pygmies like yourself?" interrupted Bertuccio once again in such a calm tone and with such a confident expression that Andrea was totally disconcerted. "You're in the grip of a terrible hand, Benedetto. It's willing to open for you. Take advantage of it. Don't play with the thunderbolt it has laid aside for a moment, but which it may take up again if you try to interfere with its freedom of movement." "I want to know who my father is," said the stubborn young man, "and I'm going to find out, no matter what it costs." "Who is my father? That's what I came here to tell you." "Ah!" cried Andrea, his eyes flashing with joy. Just then the door opened and a guard entered. "Excuse me, sir," he said to Bertuccio, "but the examining judge is waiting for the prisoner." "I'll come back tomorrow," said Bertuccio. "Good," said Andrea. "And please leave 200 francs or so on your way out so I can have some of the things I need." "I will," replied Bertuccio. Andrea held out his hand to him, but Bertuccio kept his hand in his pocket. Andrea forced himself to smile, but he was completely subjugated by Bertuccio's strange tranquility. "Could I be mistaken?" he thought. "Well, we'll see." Then he said aloud to Bertuccio, "Until tomorrow." "Until tomorrow," replied Bertuccio. Chapter 65. It will be remembered that the Abbé Busoni remained alone with Noirtier in Valentine's room and that the old man and the priest were the sole guardians of the young girl's body. The priest's Christian exhortations, or perhaps his persuasive words, apparently restored Noirtier's courage, for he soon threw off the black despair that had taken possession of him. He gave every indication of a calm resignation which was quite surprising to those who remembered his deep love for Valentine. Villefort had not seen Noirtier since the morning of Valentine's death. Locked in his study, he worked feverishly at preparing the case against the murderer of Caderousse. The affair, like everything in which the Count of Monte Cristo was involved, had made a great stir among the people of Paris. The evidence was not too convincing, for it consisted primarily of a few lines written by a dying criminal who had escaped from prison with the man he accused and who might have accused him through hatred or a desire for vengeance. Villefort alone had convinced himself that Benedetto was guilty. The trial was to begin in 3 days, thanks to Villefort's incessant work in preparing the case. His daughter Valentine had been laid to rest so recently that no one was surprised to see him so completely absorbed in his work, which was the only thing he could find to distract him from his grief. Overwhelmed with fatigue and bowed beneath the weight of a single implacable thought, Villefort went out to take a walk in the garden. Looking toward the house, he noticed that one of Noirtier's windows was open. The old man had had his chair pushed up to that window so that he could enjoy the last rays of the late summer sun. Noirtier's eyes were fixed on something with such an expression of savage hatred and burning impatience that Villefort followed his line of vision to discover the person to whom this dark look was directed. Beneath a clump of linden trees whose boughs were almost bare, he saw his wife sitting with a book in her hand. From time to time she interrupted her reading to smile at her son Edward or to toss back the ball which he obstinately persisted in throwing out into the garden from the salon. Villefort paled, for he understood Noirtier's thoughts. Suddenly Noirtier turned his gaze from the wife to the husband, and it was Villefort himself who had to undergo the attack of those fiery eyes. He began to walk slowly toward the house, but the eyes followed him as he went. filled with withering reproach and terrible menace. Then Wartier looked up at the sky, as though reminding his son of a forgotten oath. "Be patient," said Vilfort, who was now standing beneath Wartier's window. "Be patient for only one more day. I'll keep my promise." Noirtier appeared to be calmed by these words. He indifferently looked away in another direction as Vilfort violently unbuttoned his collar as though he were choking, passed his hand over his forehead and went back into his study. That night, as was his custom, Vilfort did not go to bed at the same time as the other members of his household. He stayed up till 5 o'clock in the morning reviewing the reports of the examining magistrates in the Benedetto case, carefully going through the declarations of the witnesses and putting the finishing touches on his indictment, which was one of the most energetic and skillfully conceived speeches he had ever written. He dozed off for an instant as his lamp was giving forth its last gleams. Its flickering woke him up. He went over to the window and opened it. There was a streak of reddish light across the horizon. The moist air of dawn flooded into him and revived his memory. "Today," he said with an effort, "the man who holds the sword of justice must strike wherever there's guilt." Involuntarily his eyes sought the window in which he had seen Wartier's face the day before. The curtains were drawn, but his father's image was so vivid in his mind that he addressed the closed window as though he could still see the old man's threatening eyes there. "Do not worry," he murmured. He walked around his study several times and finally stretched out on the sofa fully dressed, less in order to sleep than to rest his limbs, stiffened with the fatigue of his long night of work. Gradually the house began to awaken. From his study Vilfort could hear the opening and closing of doors, the tinkle of his wife's bell as she summoned her maid, and the first shouts of his son Edward, who awakened joyfully, as one usually does at that age. Vilfort rang. His new valet entered, bringing him the morning newspapers and a cup of hot chocolate. "What's that?" asked Vilfort. "A cup of hot chocolate," replied the valet. "I didn't ask for it. Who is being so thoughtful of me?" "Madame de Villefort, sir. She said the murder trial would probably be a great strain on you today and that you needed strength." The valet set down the cup and left the room. Villefort looked at it for a moment with a somber air, then suddenly picked it up with a nervous movement and drank down its contents in one draught. It was as though he hoped the chocolate were poisoned, as though he were calling on death to deliver him from a duty which commanded him to do something much more difficult than dying. Then he stood up and walked around his study with a sort of smile that would have been terrible to see if anyone had been watching him. The chocolate was harmless and Vilfort felt nothing. Lunchtime arrived and he did not appear at table. His valet entered and said, "Madame wishes me to inform you, sir, that it is now 11 o'clock and that court opens at noon." "Well?" "Madame is ready to leave and asks if she may go with you, sir." "Where?" "To the Palace of Justice." "Why?" "Madame says she wishes very much to be present at this trial." "Ah," said Vilfort in a tone that was almost frightening. "She wishes that, does she?" The valet stepped back and said, "If you wish to go alone, sir, I'll tell Madame so." Vilfort remained silent for a time, scratching his pale cheek with his fingernails. "Tell Madame," he replied finally, "that I wish to speak to her and that I ask her to wait for me in her room." "Yes, sir." "Then come back to shave me and dress me." "Right away, sir." The valet left, returned soon afterward, shaved Vilfort and dressed him solemnly in black. When he had finished, he said, "Madame says she'll expect you as soon as you've finished dressing, sir." "I'll go there now." Vilfort stopped before his wife's door for an instant and wiped away the sweat that was streaming down his forehead. Then he opened the door. Madame de Villefort was sitting on an ottoman, impatiently looking through some newspapers and pamphlets which young Edward, to amuse himself, was cutting to pieces before his mother had time to read them. She was completely dressed and ready to go out. Her hat was laid out on an armchair and she had already put on her gloves. "Ah, there you are," she said, her voice natural and calm. "But you're so pale. You must have worked all night again." "Well, are you going to take me with you, or shall I go with Edward?" "Edward," said Vilfort, looking at the child imperiously, "go play in the salon. I want to talk to your mother." Edward raised his head and looked at his mother, then, seeing that she did not confirm Vilfort's order, he went back to cutting off the heads of his lead soldiers. "Edward!" shouted Vilfort so harshly that the child jumped. "Did you hear what I said? Get out!" The boy, who was not accustomed to such treatment, stood up and turned pale. It would have been difficult to say whether it was from anger or from fear. His father walked over to him, took him by the arm, kissed him on the forehead and said, "Go, my son." Edward left the room. Vilfort bolted the door behind him. "What's the matter?" asked the young woman, looking searchingly at her husband and attempting to smile in the face of his icy impassivity. "Where do you keep the poison you use?" asked Vilfort bluntly, standing between his wife and the door. Madame de Vilfort felt the sensation which a lark must feel as it watches the hawk narrowing its deadly circles above its head. A hoarse, choked sound that was neither a cry nor a sigh escaped from her bosom. I don't understand," she said. "I asked you," said Vilfort in a perfectly calm voice, "where you hide the poison with which you killed my father-in-law Monsieur de Saint-Méran, my mother-in-law, Barrois and my daughter Valentine." "Oh! What are you saying?" cried Madame de Vilfort, clasping her hands. "It's not for you to question, but to answer. Am I speaking to my husband? Or to a judge?" stammered Madame de Vilfort. "To a judge, madame, to a judge." "Oh! Oh!" murmured Madame de Vilfort. She said nothing more. "You're not answering, madame?" cried the terrible interrogator. Then he added, with a smile that was still more frightening than his anger, "Of course, you're not denying anything, either." She made a movement. "And you can't deny it," continued Vilfort, putting out his hand toward her as though to seize her in the name of justice. "You carried out your crimes with a certain shameless skill, yet only those whose affection made them willing to blind themselves with regard to you could have been deceived. Ever since the death of Madame de Saint-Méran I've known there was a murderer in my house. Dr. D'Avrigny warned me. After the death of Barrois my suspicions, may God forgive me, fell on an angel. But after Valentine died I no longer had any doubt, and certain other persons were equally sure. It's time for your crimes to be made public now, and, as I've already told you, I'm not speaking to you as your husband, but as a judge." The young woman hid her face in her hands. "Oh, I beg you," she stammered, "don't believe in appearances." "Are you also cowardly?" exclaimed Vilfort contemptuously. "As a matter of fact, I've always noticed that poisoners are cowards. And yet you had the hideous courage to kill 3 people and watch them die before your eyes. Please, please. You counted the minutes of 4 death agonies," continued Vilfort with growing emotion. "You devised your devilish plans and prepared your infamous poison with wonderful skill and precision. But I wonder if you neglected to consider one thing, the consequences that your crimes might have. But that's impossible. You must at least have kept another poison, gentler yet deadlier than the other, to enable you to escape the punishment that was your due. I hope you did that. Did you?" Madame de Vilfort wrung her hands and fell to her knees. I know," went on Vilfort, "you confess, but a confession made to a judge at the last moment, when it's no longer possible to deny the crime, in no way diminishes the punishment inflicted on the criminal." "Punishment!" cried Madame de Vilfort. "That's the second time you've said it. Do you think you'll escape your punishment because you're the wife of the man who will demand it in the name of the law? No. The scaffold awaits the poisoner, whoever he may be." Madame de Vilfort uttered a wild shriek and a look of hideous, irresistible terror came over her face. "Oh, don't be afraid of the scaffold," said the magistrate. I don't want to dishonor you, for I'd be dishonoring myself also. No, if you've listened carefully to what I've said, you must realize that you can't die on the scaffold." "I don't know what you mean," murmured the wretched woman, completely discomposed. "I mean that the wife of the most outstanding magistrate of Paris will not taint him with her infamy, that she will not dishonor both her husband and her son at the same time." "No. Oh, no. Well then, that will be a good deed on your part, and I thank you for it." "You thanked me? For what?" "For what you just said." "What did I say?" "My head's in a whirl. I don't understand anything." "Oh, my God. My God. You have not answered the question I asked you when I came in. Where is the poison you use?" Madame de Villefort raised her arms and convulsively wrung her hands. "No. No," she cried vehemently. "You can't want me to do that. What I don't want is for you to die on the scaffold. Do you understand me? Have mercy on me. What I want is that justice be done," said Villefort. "I was placed on this earth to punish the guilty," he added with a fiery look. "I would send any other woman, even a queen, straight to the executioner. But to you I will be merciful. To you I say, you've kept some of your deadliest poison, haven't you? Oh, forgive me. Let me live. You're a coward. Remember that I'm your wife. You're a murderer. In the name of God. No. In the name of the love you once had for me. No. No. In the name of our child. Oh, let me live for the sake of our child. No. If I let you live you might kill him someday as you kill the others." "I? Kill my son?" cried the savage mother, throwing herself at Villefort. "Kill my Edward?" And a hideous laugh, the laugh of a demon or a madman, finished her sentence and trailed off into a groan. She fell at her husband's feet. "Remember," he said, "that if justice has not been done when I return, I will denounce you with my own lips and arrest you with my own hands." She listened to him, panting, overwhelmed, crushed. Her eyes were the only thing alive in her and they glowed with terrible fire. "You understand me," said Villefort. "I'm going to the Palace of Justice now to demand the death penalty for a murderer. If I find you alive when I return, you will be in prison by nightfall." Madame de Villefort heaved a sigh. Her strength failed her and she sank to the floor. Villefort seemed to feel a surge of pity. He looked at her less severely, leaned slightly forward and said slowly, "Goodbye, madam, goodbye." The words cut into her like a knife. She fainted. The public prosecutor walked out, locking the door behind him. Chapter 66. The Benedetto case, as it was called in the Palace of Justice and all over Paris, had produced a great sensation. The false Cavalcanti had frequented all the most fashionable spots in Paris during the few months of his splendor and had made innumerable acquaintances. The newspapers had recounted his adventures both in prison and in Paris society, which aroused a great deal of curiosity, especially among those who had known Prince Andrea Cavalcanti personally. Many of them remembered him as so amiable, so handsome and so generous that they preferred to believe he was the victim of some machination on the part of a powerful enemy. Everyone, therefore, thronged to the courtroom, some to enjoy the spectacle, others to comment on it. A line began to form outside at 7 o'clock in the morning, and an hour before the trial was set to begin the courtroom was already filled with privileged spectators. Beauchamp, who was one of the kings of the press and therefore had his throne everywhere, looked around among the crowd. He perceived Chateau Renaud and Debray, who had just won the good graces of a policeman and persuaded him to stand in back of them instead of cutting off their view, as was his right. He even promised to keep their places for them while they went over to pay a visit to Beauchamp. "Well," said Beauchamp, "have we all come to see our friend?" "Oh, yes," replied Debray. "The worthy prince. I suppose he'll be convicted, won't he?" It seems to me you're the one to answer that question. You must have spoken with the presiding magistrate at your minister's last reception. Yes, but if I've spoken to the presiding magistrate, you must have spoken to the public prosecutor. Impossible. Monsieur de Villefort hasn't seen anyone for the past week, which is only natural considering the strange series of tragedies that have taken place in his house. Look. Who is it? I thought she had left. Eugenie Danglars? Asked Chateau Renaud. Has she come back? No, it's her mother. What? Exclaimed Chateau Renaud. 10 days after her daughter's flight and 3 days after her husband's bankruptcy. Debray flushed slightly and followed Beauchamp's line of vision. Why, the woman is veiled, he said. She's some unknown lady, some foreign princess. She may even be Prince Cavalcante's mother. Here come the judges, said Chateau Renaud. Let's get back to our places. The judges and the jury took their places in the midst of a deep silence. Monsieur de Villefort, who was the object of general attention, we might almost say of general admiration, sat down in his chair and cast a serene glance around the courtroom. Gendarmes, said the presiding magistrate. Bring in the accused. At these words the attention of the spectators became more active and all eyes turned toward the door through which Benedetto was to enter. That door soon opened and the accused appeared. His features bore no trace of emotion. His hands were perfectly steady. After the accusation had been read, the presiding magistrate said, Accused, what is your name? Andrea stood up. Excuse me, Your Honor, he said, but I see that you're about to begin a series of questions in an order which I cannot follow. I will later justify my request, but in the meantime I beg you to allow me to answer the questions in a different order, which will not prevent me from answering them all. The presiding magistrate, taken aback, looked at the jury, who looked at the public prosecutor. The spectators manifested great surprise, but none of this seemed to make any impression on Andrea. What is your age? Asked the presiding magistrate. I'll be 21 in a few days. I was born on September 27, 1815. Monsieur de Villefort, who had been taking notes, raised his head at the mention of this date. Where were you born? In Auteuil, near Paris. Villefort looked up a second time, stared at Andrea as he would have stared at the head of Medusa and turned livid. What is your profession? Continued the presiding magistrate. I began as a forger, said Andrea with perfect tranquility, then I was a thief, and recently I became a murderer. A murmur, or rather a storm of indignation burst forth from all over the courtroom. Even the judges looked at one another in amazement and the members of the jury manifested great disgust at the prisoner's cynicism, so unexpected from such an elegant young man. And now will you condescend to tell the court your name? Asked the presiding magistrate. The pride with which you have enumerated your crimes, which you call your profession, may be the reason why you wanted to postpone telling us your name. Perhaps you wanted to make it stand out by the titles which precede it. It's incredible how clearly you've read my thoughts, Your Honor, said Andrea politely. That's precisely why I asked you to change the usual order of questions. The general astonishment reached its height. There was no longer any bravado or cynicism in the prisoner's manner. The spectators had a keen presentiment that some sort of storm was about to burst. Well, then, what is your name? Asked the presiding magistrate. I can't tell you my name because I don't know what it is, but I do know my father's name and I can tell it to you. Tell us the name of your father, then. My father is a public prosecutor, replied Andrea calmly. Public prosecutor, exclaimed the presiding magistrate, not noticing the violent agitation which appeared on Villefort's face. Yes, and since you've asked me for his name I'll tell it to you. His name is Villefort. A thunderous explosion burst forth from the entire courtroom, and it was 5 minutes before the magistrate succeeded in restoring order. In the midst of the uproar, at least 10 persons crowded around the public prosecutor, who slumped half unconscious in his chair, to offer him consolation, encouragement, protestations and sympathy. Calm was finally established in the courtroom, with the exception of one corner of the room where, it was said, a woman had just fainted. Someone gave her smelling salts and she regained her senses. "Your Honor," said Andrea, "I am not trying to insult this court or create a useless scandal. I was asked to give my name, but I was unable to, since my parents abandoned me. But I do know my father's name. I repeat, his name is Vilfort and I am prepared to prove it." "But," said the presiding magistrate angrily, "during your examination you said your name was Benedetto, that you were an orphan and that you were born in Corsica." "I said that because I didn't want my declaration to be silenced, which would surely have happened if I had told the truth then. But now I tell you that I was born in Auteuil on September 27, 1817, and that I am the son of the public prosecutor, Monsieur de Villefort. Would you like more details? I'll be glad to give them to you. I was born at 28 Rue de la Fontaine in Auteuil, in a room hung with red damask. My father picked me up, told my mother I was dead, wrapped me in a towel marked with an H and an N, carried me out into the garden and buried me alive." A shudder ran through the spectators as they watched the public prosecutor's terror grow in proportion to the young man's self-assurance. "How do you know all those details?" asked the presiding magistrate. "I'm about to tell you that, Your Honor. A certain Corsican had sworn vengeance against my father and was lying in wait for him in the garden the night my father buried me. He stabbed my father as soon as he had finished covering me with earth. Then, thinking it was some sort of treasure my father had buried, he opened the grave and found me still alive. He took me to an orphanage. 3 months later his sister-in-law came to Paris, claimed me as her son and took me back to Corsica with her. That's why, although I was born in Auteuil, I was raised in Corsica." There was a moment of profound silence. "Continue," said the presiding magistrate. "I might have been happy with those good people, who adored me, but my perverse nature won out over all the virtue my stepmother tried to instill in me. I grew up evil and soon turned to crime. One day when I was cursing God for making me so evil and giving me such a hideous destiny, my stepfather said to me, 'Don't blaspheme against God. He created you without anger. The crime was on the part of your father, who doomed you to hell if you died and to poverty if a miracle saved your life.' From then on I stopped blaspheming against God, but I cursed my father. And that's why I've spoken here the words for which you've reproached me, Your Honor. That's why I've caused the scandal which has shaken this whole assembly. If I've committed another crime in doing so, punish me for it. But if I've convinced you that my destiny was tragic and bitter from the day of my birth, pity me." "But what about your mother?" asked the presiding magistrate. "My mother believed I died at birth. She is not guilty in any way. I didn't want to know her name, and to this day I don't know who she is." At this moment a shrill cry, ending in a sob, arose from the midst of the group of people surrounding the woman who had fainted a short time before. She had just succumbed to a violent fit of hysteria. As she was being carried from the courtroom, the veil which had hidden her face fell aside and several spectators recognized her as Madame Danglars. Despite his shattered nerves, the buzzing in his ears and the near madness which had taken possession of his brain, Villefort also recognized her and stood up. "What about the proof you mentioned?" said the presiding magistrate. "The proof?" said Benedetto, laughing. "Do you really want it?" "Yes." "Well, then, look at Monsieur de Villefort and ask him for the proof." All eyes turned to the public prosecutor, who, under the weight of all those looks, staggered to the center of the courtroom. His hair was in disorder and his face bore the marks of his own fingernails. The entire assembly uttered a long murmur of astonishment. "They've asked me for proof, father," said Benedetto. Shall I give it to them? No, no, stammered Vilfort in a choked voice. That would be useless. What do you mean? Cried the presiding magistrate. I mean, cried Vilfort, that I realized it would be useless for me to struggle against the vengeance of God which has just struck me. There's no need for proof. Everything this young man has said is true. What? Are you sure you're not the victim of an hallucination, Monsieur de Villefort? Have you temporarily lost your reason? Such a strange, unexpected and horrible accusation may have troubled your mind. We can certainly all understand that. Villefort shook his head. His teeth chattered violently, like those of a man consumed by fever. My mind is perfectly lucid, Your Honor, he said. I acknowledge myself guilty of all the charges this young man has brought against me, and I now hold myself at the disposal of the public prosecutor who will be my successor. After speaking these words in a choked and almost inaudible voice, Monsieur de Villefort staggered out of the courtroom. The entire assembly was plunged into speechless consternation by the revelation which had just brought to such a terrible climax the series of events which had been agitating Paris society for the past 2 weeks. Now I'd like to hear someone say there's no drama in real life, said Beauchamp. My God! Exclaimed Chateau Renaud. I'd much rather finish like Monsieur de Morcerf. A pistol shot seems pleasant compared to a catastrophe like this. And to think that I once thought of marrying his daughter, said Debray. She did well to die, poor girl. Court is adjourned, said the presiding magistrate, and the case is postponed to the next session. Andrea, still calm, left the courtroom escorted by gendarmes, who involuntarily showed him a certain respect. Well, what do you think of that? Said Debray to the policeman as he slipped a 20-franc coin into his hand. There will be extenuating circumstances, replied the policeman. Chapter 67. It would be difficult to depict the state of stupefaction in which Villefort left the Palace of Justice, to describe the fever which made all his arteries pound, stiffened all his fibers, made all his veins swell almost to bursting, and transformed every point of his body into so many centers of pain. He dragged himself through the corridors, guided only by habit. Outside he saw his carriage, awakened his coachman by opening the door himself, sank into the seat and pointed in the direction of the Faubourg Saint-Honore. The coachman started the horses. The whole weight of his ruined life had just fallen on Villefort's head. He was crushed by the weight, but he was not yet clearly aware of the consequences. He felt them, but he had not measured them. He felt the presence of God in the depths of his heart. God, 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 he murmured, without knowing what he was saying. He saw only God behind the culmination which had just taken place. The carriage rolled swiftly along. As he writhed on the cushions of the seat, Villefort felt something that bothered him. He put his hand on the object. It was a fan which Madame de Villefort had left behind in the carriage. It brought back his memory like a flash of lightning in the middle of a dark night. He thought of his wife. Oh! He cried out, as though a red-hot iron had pierced his heart. For the past hour he had had only one aspect of his wretchedness before his eyes. Another aspect of it, no less terrible, had just been thrust upon his awareness. He had assumed the role of an implacable judge with his wife. He had sentenced her to death. Stricken with terror, crushed by remorse, overwhelmed by the shame into which he had plunged her with the eloquence of his irreproachable virtue, she was perhaps at that very moment preparing to die. An hour had passed since her death sentence. She was no doubt thinking back over her crimes, praying to God for mercy and writing a letter to her virtuous husband to beg his forgiveness, which she was about to pay for with her own death. Villefort uttered a second cry of grief and rage. Oh! He cried, writhing on the satin cushions of his carriage. She became a criminal only because she touched me. I'm filled with crime and she caught it from me as though it were cholera or the plague. And I punished her. I dared to say to her, repent and die. I said that. Oh, no, she's alive. She'll come with me. We'll leave France, we'll go as far as the earth will carry us. I spoke to her of the scaffold. Oh, my God, how did I dare utter that word? The scaffold is waiting for me, too. We'll flee. Yes, I'll confess everything to her. Every day I'll humiliate myself and tell her that I, too, have committed a crime, a marriage between a tiger and a serpent. A wife worthy of a husband like me. She must live, so that her infamy can pale before mine. Villefort pushed down the glass between him and his coachman. Faster! Faster! He shouted in a voice which made the coachman start on his seat. The horses, carried along by fear, flew toward the house. Yes, yes, repeated Villefort to himself as he approached his home. She must live, so that she can repent and raise my son. She loved Edward. It was for him that she did it all. The heart of a mother who loves her child can't be hopelessly bad. She repented. No one will ever know she was guilty. The crimes committed in my house, which are beginning to rouse suspicion now, will be forgotten with time. But if some of my enemies should remember them, I'll place them on the list of my own crimes. My wife will flee, taking money with her, and, above all, taking my son with her. She'll live and she'll be happy again, because all her love is in her son, and her son won't leave her. I'll have done a noble action. That relieves the heart. And Villefort breathed more freely than he had done in a long time. The carriage stopped before his house. He leaped out of it and hurried up the steps. His servants seemed surprised to see him return so soon, but he read nothing else in their faces. As he went past Noirtier's room, he saw two figures through the half-open door, but he gave no thought to the person who was with his father. His thoughts were elsewhere. Nothing has changed here, he said to himself as he climbed the small staircase leading to his wife's apartment in Valentine's empty bedroom. He approached the door and put his hand on the crystal knob. The door opened. Not locked. He murmured, "Good. Very good." He entered the small salon in which a bed was placed at night for Edward. He glanced around the room. No one, he said to himself. She must be in her bedroom. He rushed over to the door. This one was locked. He stopped, shuddering, and called out, "Heloise!" He seemed to hear a piece of furniture being moved. "Heloise!" he repeated. "Who's there?" asked his wife's voice. "Open the door." "Open it." "It's I." But, despite this order and the anguished tone in which it was given, the door remained closed. Villefort kicked it open. Madame de Villefort was standing in the doorway between her bedroom and her boudoir. She was pale, her features were contracted and her eyes stared at him with frightening fixity. "Heloise! Heloise! What's the matter? Speak to me." "It's done," she said with a groan that seemed to tear her throat. "What more do you want from me?" And she fell to the floor. Villefort ran over to her and seized her hand. She was dead. Maddened with horror, he stepped back to the doorway and stared at the corpse. "My son!" he cried suddenly. "Where's my son? Edward! Edward!" He rushed out of the apartment, still crying out, "Edward! Edward!" This name was pronounced with such anguish that the servants came running up. "My son! Where's my son?" asked Villefort. "Take him out of the house so he won't see." "He's not downstairs," said Villefort's valet. "Then he must be playing in the garden." "No, sir. Madame sent for him about half an hour ago. He went into her room and hasn't come downstairs since then." Icy sweat broke out on Villefort's forehead, his legs began to tremble and his thoughts began to whirl madly in his brain. "In her room," he murmured. He began slowly to retrace his steps, wiping his forehead with one hand and supporting himself against the wall with the other. On returning to her room, he had to see his poor wife's body once again. In order to call Edward, he had to awaken the echoes of that apartment transformed into a coffin. To speak was to violate the silence of the tomb. He felt his tongue almost paralyzed. "Edward, Edward," he stammered. There was no answer. Villefort took a step forward. His wife's body lay across the doorway leading into the boudoir where Edward must necessarily be. Her body seemed to be guarding the doorway with open, staring eyes and a terrifying smile of mysterious irony. He stepped forward a little closer, looked into the boudoir and saw his son lying on the sofa. The child was no doubt asleep. The wretched man felt a surge of unspeakable joy. All he had to do now was to step over the corpse, enter the boudoir, take the child in his arms and flee with him, far, far away. Villefort was no longer the man whose refined corruption made him a model of civilization. He was no longer afraid of prejudices, but of ghosts. He summoned up his courage and leaped over the corpse as though it were a bed of burning coals. He picked up the child, held him tightly, shook him and called to him. Edward did not answer. He kissed his cheeks. They were livid and cold. He felt his stiffened limbs and put his hand over his heart. The heart was no longer beating. The boy was dead. A piece of paper fell from Edward's breast. Villefort, thunderstruck, sank to his knees. The child slipped from his arms and rolled beside his mother. Villefort picked up the piece of paper, recognized his wife's handwriting and eagerly read these words: "You know I was a good mother, because it was for the sake of my son that I became a criminal. A good mother does not leave without her son." Villefort could not believe his eyes. He could not believe his reason. He dragged himself over to Edward's body and examined it with meticulous attention. Then a heart-rending cry burst from his breast. "God!" he murmured. "Always God." He began to feel a mounting horror at being alone with those two corpses. A short time before he had been sustained by rage and despair, but now his head was bowed by the crushing weight of his grief, and he, who had never felt pity for anyone, went to see his father in order to have someone to whom he could relate his misfortune, someone at whose side he could weep. He walked up the stairs and entered Noirtier's room. The old man was listening attentively to the Abbé Busoni, who was as calm and cold as ever. Villefort put his hand to his forehead when he saw the priest. He remembered the visit he had paid him on the day of Valentine's death. "You again?" he said. "Do you come only to escort death?" Busoni looked up. On seeing Villefort's disheveled face and the wild gleam in his eyes, he assumed that the courtroom scene had been brought to its conclusion. He knew nothing of the events that had followed. "I came here to pray for your daughter's soul," replied Busoni. "And why have you come today?" "I've come to tell you that you've paid your debt to me and that from now on I will pray God not to punish you any further." "My God!" exclaimed Villefort, stepping back in terror. "That's not the voice of the Abbé Busoni." "No, it isn't." The priest tore off his false tonsure, shook his head, and his long black hair, released from its confinement, fell down around his manly face. "That's the face of the Count of Monte Cristo!" cried Villefort wildly. "That's still not it, Monsieur de Villefort. Think further back. That voice, where did I hear it for the first time? You heard it in Marseille 23 years ago, on the day of your marriage to Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran. You're not Busoni? You're not Monte Cristo? Oh, my God! So you're that hidden, implacable enemy. I wronged you in some way in Marseille? Yes, that's right," said the Count, crossing his arms over his broad chest. "Think further back." "But what did I do to you?" cried Villefort, whose mind was hovering between sanity and madness. "What did I do to you? Tell me. Speak. You condemned me to a slow and hideous death, you killed my father, and you deprived me of love, freedom and fortune. Who are you? In the name of God, who are you?" "I am the ghost of a wretched man you once buried in the dungeon of the Château d'If. When that ghost finally came out of its grave, God placed on it the mask of the Count of Monte Cristo and covered it with gold and diamonds so that you wouldn't recognize it until today. Ah! I recognize you. I recognize you. You're... I am Edmond Dantes. You're Edmond Dantes, cried Villefort, seizing the Count's wrist. Then come with me. He led him down the stairs. Monte Cristo followed him in astonishment, not knowing where Villefort was leading him, but sensing some new disaster. Look, Edmond Dantes, said Villefort, pointing to the bodies of his wife and son. Is your vengeance complete now? Monte Cristo paled at the horrible sight. He realized that he had gone beyond the limits of rightful vengeance and that he could no longer say, God is for me and with me. He rushed over to the boy's body with a feeling of inexpressible anguish, opened his eyes, felt his pulse, then picked him up, carried him into Valentine's room and locked the door. My son! Cried Villefort. He's carrying away the body of my son. He tried to run after Monte Cristo, but, as in a nightmare, he felt his feet rooted to the floor. His eyes seemed ready to burst from their sockets. His fingers sank into his chest until his nails were red with blood. The veins of his temples swelled and seemed to deluge his brain with fire. He stood transfixed for several minutes until the frightful overthrow of his reason had been accomplished. Then he uttered a loud shriek followed by a long burst of laughter and ran down the stairs. A quarter of an hour later the door to Valentine's room opened and the Count of Monte Cristo reappeared. His features, ordinarily so calm and noble, were contorted with grief. In his arms he held the body of Edward, whom he had been unable to bring back to life. He put one knee to the floor and reverently laid the boy beside his mother with his head on her breast. Then he stood up and walked out of the room. He met a servant on the stairs. Where is Monsieur de Villefort? He asked. The servant, without answering, pointed toward the garden. Monte Cristo walked out into the garden and saw Villefort furiously digging in the ground with a spade while a group of his servants stood around him watching. He's not here, said Villefort. This isn't the right place. And he began to dig a little further on. Monte Cristo stepped up to him and said softly, Monsieur de Villefort, you've lost a son, but... Oh, I'll find him, interrupted Villefort. It won't do you any good to say he's not here. I'll find him if I have to search till the last judgment. Monte Cristo recoiled in terror. Oh! He exclaimed. He's gone mad. Then, as though he were afraid the walls of that accursed house might collapse on his head, he hurried out into the street, doubting for the first time that he had the right to do what he had done. When he arrived home he met Maximilian, who had been wandering through the house on the Champs-Élysées as silently as a spectre waiting for the time fixed by God to enter its grave again. Prepare yourself, Maximilian, said the Count with a smile. We're leaving Paris tomorrow. You have nothing more to do here? Asked Maximilian. No, replied Monte Cristo. And God grant that I haven't done too much already. Chapter 68. The events which had just taken place occupied the attention of everyone in Paris. Emmanuel and Julie spoke about them with understandable surprise in their house on the Rue Michelet. They compared the three sudden and unexpected disasters which had befallen Danglars, Morcerf and Villefort. Maximilian, who had come to pay them a visit, listened to their conversation without taking part in it, plunged into his customary apathy. What terrible catastrophes, said Emmanuel, thinking of Morcerf and Danglars. What terrible suffering, said Julie, thinking of Valentine, but, guided by her woman's intuition, not wishing to mention the poor girl's name before her brother. If it was God who struck them down, said Emmanuel, it was because he could find nothing in their past to merit a mitigation of their punishment. He had hardly finished speaking when the door of the salon opened and the Count of Monte Cristo appeared in the doorway. Julie and Emmanuel uttered an exclamation of joy. Maximilian raised his head and then let it fall again. Maximilian, said the Count, without appearing to notice the different impressions his arrival had produced. "I've come to take you with me." "To take me with you?" said Maximilian, as though awakening from a dream. "Yes. Didn't I tell you to be ready to leave?" "And I'm ready," replied Maximilian. "I came to tell them goodbye." "Where are you going, Count?" asked Julie. "First of all, to Marseille." "To Marseille?" repeated the young couple. "Yes, and I'm taking your brother with me." "Oh, try to bring them back to us cured," said Julie. Maximilian turned away to hide his emotion. "Then you've noticed that he was suffering?" asked the Count. "Yes. I'm afraid he's been bored with us." "I'll divert him," replied the Count. "I'm ready to leave, Count," said Maximilian. "Goodbye, dear friends. Goodbye, Emmanuel. Goodbye, Julie." "What do you mean?" cried Julie. "How can you leave so suddenly like this, without preparation, without passports?" "Delay increases the sorrow of parting," said Monte Cristo, "and I'm sure Maximilian has made all his preparations. I instructed him to do so, at least. I have my passport and my trunks are packed," said Maximilian dully. "And you're leaving us immediately, without warning?" asked Julie. "My carriage is at the door. I must be in Rome 5 days from now." "Is Maximilian going to Rome too?" asked Emmanuel. "I'll go wherever the Count wants to take me," said Maximilian with a sad smile. "I belong to him for the next month." "Oh, he speaks so strangely, Count. Your brother will be with me, so don't worry about him," said the Count with his persuasive friendliness. "Goodbye, Julie," repeated Maximilian. "Goodbye, Emmanuel. He breaks my heart with his indifference," said Julie. "Oh, Maximilian, you're hiding something from us. You'll see him come back gay and laughing," said Monte Cristo. Maximilian shot him a glance that was almost scornful, almost angry. "Let's go," said the Count. "Before you leave, Count," said Julie, "let me tell you everything that, the other day, nothing you could tell me would ever be worth what I see in your eyes, what you thought in your heart and what I felt in my own heart," said Monte Cristo, taking her hands in his. "I ought to have left without seeing you again, like the benefactor in a novel, but such virtue was beyond my strength because I'm a weak and vain man, because it does me good to see gratitude, joy and affection in the eyes of my fellow men. I'm leaving now, and I carry my egotism to the point of saying, don't forget me, my friends, for you will probably never see me again." "Never see you again?" cried Emmanuel, while 2 large tears rolled down Julie's cheeks. "Then you must be a god, you must be about to go back up to heaven after having appeared on earth to do us good." "Don't say that," said Monte Cristo. "The gods never do evil. They always stop where they want to stop. Chance is never stronger than they are, on the contrary, it is they who dominate chance. No, I'm a man, Emmanuel, and your admiration is as undeserved as your words are sacrilegious." He clasped Emmanuel's hand and pressed Julie's to his lips, then he tore himself away from that house which happiness seemed to have made its home and motioned to Maximilian, who was still as sorrowful and apathetic as he had been on the day of Valentine's death. "Make our brother happy again," whispered Julie in Monte Cristo's ear. He pressed her hand as he had done 11 years before on the staircase leading to her father's study. "Do you still have faith in Sinbad the sailor?" he asked, smiling. "Oh, yes. Then have no fear." As the Count had said, his carriage was waiting for him at the door. 4 vigorous horses were shaking their manes and stamping the pavement impatiently. Ali was waiting at the bottom of the steps, his face gleaming with perspiration. He had apparently just returned from a long errand. "Did you see the old man?" asked the Count in Arabic. Ali nodded. "And did you open the letter before his eyes, as I ordered you to do?" Ali nodded once again. "What did he say? Or rather, what did he do?" Ali closed his eyes as Noirtier did when he wished to say yes. "Good, he agrees," said Monte Cristo. "Let's go." The carriage set off and the horses' hoofs struck showers of sparks from the pavement. Maximilian settled back into his corner without saying a word. Half an hour passed. Then the carriage stopped. The Count had just pulled a silken cord attached to Alice's finger. The Nubian descended and opened the door. The night was bright with stars. They were on top of the hill of Villejuif, from which Paris, spread out like a dark sea below, agitates its millions of lights like phosphorescent waves. Waves more tumultuous, more seething, more furious than those of the angry ocean, waves which never know calm like those of the vast sea, waves forever clashing, forever foaming, forever engulfing. The Count remained alone. At a signal from him the carriage went forward a few paces. He stood for a long time with his arms crossed, contemplating that modern Babylon which makes the religious poet dream, as well as the scoffing materialist. "Great city," he murmured, bowing his head as though in prayer. "It was less than 6 months ago that I entered your gates. I believe that the Spirit of God led me there, and he has led me out triumphant. He alone knows that I now leave without hatred or pride, but not without regret. He alone knows that I have not used the power with which he entrusted me either for myself or for vain causes. Great city, it was in your throbbing bosom that I found what I sought. Like a patient miner, I have dug deep into your entrails to root out the evil there. Now my work is completed. My mission is accomplished. You can no longer give me either joy or sorrow. Farewell, Paris. Farewell." He looked once again over that vast plain like some spirit of the night, then he climbed back into his carriage, which soon disappeared over the top of the hill in a cloud of dust and noise. They traveled for 2 leagues without speaking. "Maximilian," said the Count finally, "do you regret having come with me?" "No, Count, but leaving Paris." "If I had thought happiness was waiting for you in Paris, Maximilian, I would have left you there. But that's where Valentine is lying. Leaving Paris is like losing her a second time." "Maximilian," said Monte Cristo, "the friends we have lost are buried in our hearts, not in the earth. I have 2 friends who are always with me in my heart. One is the man who gave me life. The other is the man who gave me intelligence. I consult them when I'm in doubt, and if I've done any good in this world I owe it to their advice. Consult the voice of your heart, Maximilian, and ask it if you ought to go on showing me that gloomy expression." "My friend," replied Maximilian, "the voice of my heart is very sad and promises me nothing but sorrow. A weakened mind always sees everything through a black veil. The soul makes its own horizons. Your soul is dark, which is why you see such a cloudy sky." "That may be true," said Maximilian, and he sank back into his silent reverie. The journey was made with that speed which was one of the Count's marvelous powers. Cities passed like shadows along their route. The trees, shaken by the first winds of autumn, seemed to rush toward them like disheveled giants, then flee swiftly away from them as soon as they reached them. The next morning they arrived at Chalons, where the Count's steamboat was waiting for them. The carriage was placed on board without a moment's delay and the 2 travelers continued on their way. The ship was built for speed. Her paddle wheels were like 2 wings with which she skimmed the surface of the water like a bird. Even Maximilian felt the intoxication of speed, and from time to time the wind which tousled his hair seemed almost to dissipate. For a moment the clouds gathered over his brow. As for the Count, as he moved further and further away from Paris, an almost superhuman serenity seemed to envelop him. He was like an exile returning to his native land. Soon Marseille came into view, white, warm and full of life. A host of memories was aroused in both of them by the sight of that round tower, that Fort St. Nicholas, that Hotel de Ville and that brick quay where they had both played as children. As though by a common accord, they both stopped on the Canebière. A ship was about to set sail for Algiers. The passengers crowded on deck, and the throng of relatives and friends weeping and shouting as they bid farewell was always a touching spectacle, even for those who see it every day, but it was unable to distract Maximilian from the thought that had taken possession of his mind from the moment he set foot on the quay. "Look," he said, taking the Count by the arm, "here's where my father stood when the Pharaon sailed into port. This is where the brave man you saved from death and dishonor threw himself into my arms. I can still feel his tears on my face. And he didn't weep alone. Many people around us were also weeping." Monte Cristo smiled. "I was there," he said, pointing to a street corner. As he said this, from the direction in which he had pointed they heard a sorrowful groan and saw a woman waving goodbye to a passenger on the ship that was about to leave. She was veiled. Monte Cristo watched her with an emotion which Maximilian could easily have noticed if his eyes had not been fixed on the ship. "Look, I'm not mistaken," cried Maximilian. "That young man in uniform, the one waving his hat, it's Albert de Morcerf." "Yes," said Monte Cristo, "I recognized him. How could you when you were looking in the opposite direction?" The Count smiled as he did when he did not wish to answer, and turned his eyes back to the veiled woman as she disappeared around a corner. Then he said to Maximilian, "My friend, don't you have some things to do here?" "I have to weep over my father's grave," replied Maximilian dully. "Very well. Go to the cemetery and wait for me. I'll meet you there." "Are you leaving me now?" "Yes. I also have a pious visit to make." Monte Cristo watched Maximilian until he had disappeared, then he turned his steps toward the alleys de Milan and the little house which the beginning of this story has made familiar to the reader. That house, still charming despite its dilapidation, was the same one in which Dante's father had lived. However, while the old man had occupied only the garret, the Count had placed the entire house at Mercédès' disposal. It was there that the veiled woman had gone when Monte Cristo watched her walk away from the quay. For him the worn steps of the house were old friends, and he knew better than anyone else how to open that weather-beaten door. He entered without knocking, like a friend or a guest. At the end of a path paved with bricks opened a small garden rich in warmth and sunlight, the same garden in which Mercédès had found the money in the place indicated to her by the Count, whose tact had made its burial there date from 24 years before. Mercédès was sitting in an arbor, weeping. She had raised her veil and, with her face hidden in her hands, was giving vent to all the sighs and sobs which the presence of her son had forced her to hold back. Monte Cristo stepped forward. Mercédès looked up and uttered a cry of alarm at seeing a man suddenly appear before her. "It's no longer in my power to give you happiness," said the Count, "but I can offer you consolation. Would you accept it as coming from a friend?" "It's true that I'm deeply unhappy," said Mercédès. "I'm all alone in the world now. I had no one but my son, and he has left me." "He did the right thing," said the Count, "and he has a noble heart. If he stayed with you his life would have become useless and he would never have been able to accustom himself to your sorrow. His powerlessness would have made him bitter, but now he'll become strong by struggling against his adversity and changing it into a fortune. Let him reconstruct your future. It's in safe hands." "Oh," said the poor woman, sadly shaking her head, "I won't enjoy that fortune you mention and which I pray God to grant him. So many things have been shattered inside me and around me that I feel myself near the grave. You were right to bring me back here where I was once so happy. One ought to die where one was happy." "Your words burn into my heart," said Monte Cristo, "especially since you have every reason to hate me. I'm the cause of all your misfortune." "Hate you, Edmond? Hate the man who spared my son's life, for it was your intention to kill the son of whom Monsieur de Morcerf was so proud, wasn't it? Oh, look at me and you'll see that there's not even the shadow of a reproach in me. Monte Cristo took her hand and kissed it respectfully, but she felt that his kiss was without ardor, like a kiss he might have placed on the marble hand of the statue of a saint. There are some predestined lives whose whole future is ruined by an early mistake, continued Mercedes. When I believed you to be dead, I too should have died. What good did it do for me to mourn your loss eternally in my heart? It has done nothing except make a woman of 39 appear to be 50. Oh, I was weak and cowardly. I denied my love and, like all renegades, I bring misfortune to everyone around me. No, Mercedes, said Monte Cristo, you judge yourself much too severely. You're a noble and honorable woman and you disarmed me for a moment with your sorrow, but behind me, invisible, unknown and wrathful, there was God, of whom I was only the agent and who did not choose to prevent my blows from reaching their mark. Examine the past and the present, try to guess the future and then decide whether or not I'm the instrument of God. The most horrible disasters, the cruelest suffering, the abandonment of those who loved me, the persecution of those who didn't even know me, that was the first part of my life. Then, after my captivity, solitude and misery, came freedom and a fortune so extraordinarily immense that I would have had to be blind not to see that God had sent it to me as part of some great design. From then on I considered that fortune as a sacred trust. From then on I gave no thought to ordinary life and its pleasures. From then on I knew not 1 hour of peace. I felt myself driven like a cloud of fire descending from heaven to destroy an accursed city. Like an adventurous captain setting out on a perilous expedition, I laid in my provisions, loaded my weapons and prepared every means of attack and defense. I accustomed my body to the most vigorous exercises and my soul to the most violent shocks. I taught my arm to kill, my eyes to watch suffering and my lips to smile at the most terrible sights. From the kind, trusting and forgiving man I had once been, I made myself vindictive, crafty and cruel, or, rather, impassive like deaf and blind fate itself. Then I set out on the path that lay before me and I reached my goal. Woe to those whom I met on my way. Enough, Edmund, said Mercedes. Believe me when I say that the woman who was the only one to recognize you was also the only one to understand you. Even if you had crushed me on your way, Edmund, I would still have admired you. Just as there is a vast gulf between me and the past, so there is a vast gulf between you and other men, and I admit to you that my most painful torture is to compare you, for there is nothing in the world that can equal you and nothing that resembles you. Now tell me goodbye, Edmund, and let us part. Before I leave you, Mercedes, tell me what you want. I want only one thing, my son's happiness. Pray God to keep him from death, and I will do the rest. Thank you, Edmund. But what about you? I need nothing. I live between two graves. One is that of Edmond Dantes, who died so long ago and whom I loved. I wouldn't part with that memory for anything in the world. The other is that of a man whom Edmond Dantes killed. I approve of the deed, but I must still pray for the victim's soul. But what will you do? I can no longer do anything but pray, and I have no need to work. I found the little treasure you buried where you left it. Mercedes, I can't reproach you for it, but you did exaggerate your sacrifice when you abandoned all your husband's fortune, half of which rightfully belonged to you because of your economy and your vigilance. I know what you're about to offer me, Edmund, but I can't accept it. My son would forbid it. Then I won't do anything for you that wouldn't have his approval. I'll find out what his intentions are and abide by them. But if he agrees to let me do what I want to do, will you also agree? I'm no longer a thinking creature, Edmund. God has so shaken me with his storms that I've lost my will. Since I'm alive, he doesn't want me to die. If he sends help to me, it will be because he wants me to accept it. That's not how we ought to worship God, said Monte Cristo. God wants us to understand him and discuss his purposes. That's why he gave us free will. Don't say that. cried Mercedes. "If I believed God had given me free will, what would remain to save me from utter despair?" Monte Cristo bowed his head before the vehemence of her sorrow. "Will you tell me au revoir?" he asked, holding out his hand to her. "Yes, I'll tell you au revoir," replied Mercedes, solemnly pointing to the sky. "I'll say it to prove to you that I still hope." After touching the Count's trembling hand, Mercedes turned and hurried up the stairs. The Count walked slowly out of the house and back toward the harbor. Although Mercedes was at the window of the little room in which the elder Dantes had once lived, she did not see Monte Cristo leave. Her eyes were searching in the distance the ship that was carrying her son away from her. It is true, however, that as she did so she murmured softly, as though in spite of herself, "Edmund." Edmund. Chapter 69. The Count was heavy-hearted as he left Mercedes, in all probability never to see her again. Since the death of little Edward a great change had taken place in Monte Cristo. Having arrived at the summit of his vengeance after his slow and tortuous climb, he had looked down into the abyss of doubt. Furthermore, his conversation with Mercedes had awakened a host of memories which now had to be overcome. A man of the Count's character could not remain for long in that state of melancholy. He told himself that in order for him to come to the point of blaming himself, an error must somehow have slipped into his calculations. "I'm not considering the past correctly," he thought. "I can't have made such a mistake. Can my goal have been senseless? Can I have been following a false path for 10 years? I refuse to accept such an idea. It would make me lose my reason. The reason for my present doubt is that I no longer see the past clearly. The past fades away with time as objects fade away with distance. The same thing is happening to me as happens to people in dreams when they see and feel a wound but can't remember having received it." Monte Cristo walked down the Rue Saint Laurent to the quay. A pleasure boat was passing with its canopy spread. Monte Cristo called to its owner, who hurried eagerly over to him, hoping for a good fare. It was a beautiful day, but, despite the clear sky, the graceful boats they passed in the harbor and the golden sunlight with which everything was flooded, the Count, wrapped in his cloak, remembered one by one the details of the terrible trip he had made there years before, the sight of the Chateau d'If which told him where he was being taken, the struggle with the gendarmes when he tried to leap into the sea, his despair when he felt himself vanquished, and the sensation of cold when the barrel of the carbine was pressed against his forehead like a ring of ice. Like those springs dried up in summer which gradually begin to flow again when the clouds of autumn gather above them, Monte Cristo began to feel the bitterness which had once flooded the heart of Edmond Dantes. From then on there was no more clear sky and sunlight for him. The sky became veiled in mourning, and the appearance of the black mass of the Chateau d'If made him start as though he had suddenly seen the ghost of a deadly enemy. As they approached the island, the Count instinctively retreated to the stern of the boat. "We're about to land, sir," said the boatman. Monte Cristo remembered that it was at the same spot, at the same rock, that he had been violently dragged ashore by the gendarmes, and that they had forced him to climb that same ramp at the point of a bayonet. There had been no prisoners in the Chateau d'If since the July Revolution. It was now inhabited only by a detachment of guards whose duty was to prevent its being used by smugglers. There was a guide waiting at the gate to show visitors through the Monument of Terror, now become simply an object of curiosity. And yet, although he knew all this, when Monte Cristo descended the dark staircase and was led to the dungeon he had asked to see, a cold pallor invaded his forehead and he pushed an icy perspiration back into his heart. The Count asked if any of the former jailers still remained and was told that they had all been retired or given other positions. The guide who was conducting him had been there only since 1830. Monte Cristo was led into his own cell. He saw the dim light filtering in through the narrow window. He saw the place where his bed had been, and, although now filled in, the opening made by the Abbé Faria was still visible. Monte Cristo felt his legs give way beneath him. He sat down on a wooden stool. "Are there any stories connected with this prison other than that of Mirabeau's imprisonment?" asked the Count. "Yes, sir," replied the guide. "One of the jailers told me a story about this very cell. Would you like to hear it?" "Yes," said Monte Cristo. "Tell me." And he placed his hand over his heart to repress its violent beating, frightened at the thought of hearing his own story. "This cell," began the guide, "was once inhabited by a prisoner who was a very dangerous man, or so I was told, at least. Another man was a prisoner here at the same time, but he wasn't at all dangerous. He was a poor priest who had gone mad." "I see," said Monte Cristo. "And what form did his madness take?" "He was always offering to pay millions of francs for his freedom." "Could the two prisoners see each other?" "Oh, no, sir. That was forbidden. But they finally made a secret passage between their cells." "Which one of them made the passage?" "It must have been the young man. He was strong and energetic, while the poor priest was old and weak. Besides, the priest's mind was too confused to follow a single idea." "Blind fools," thought the Count. "No one knows how the young man made the passage," continued the guide, "but there's no doubt that he made it. Look, you can still see the trace of it." He moved his torch up against the wall. "Oh, yes," said the Count in a voice hoarse with emotion. "As a result, the two prisoners were able to communicate with each other. No one knows how long this lasted, but one day the old prisoner fell ill and died. Can you imagine what the young one did then?" "No. Tell me." "He carried the body into his own cell and put it into his bed with its face toward the wall. Then he went back to the other cell, closed off the secret passage and got into the sack they had sewed up the body in." Monte Cristo closed his eyes and seemed to experience once again all the sensations he had felt when the coarse cloth of the sack, still impregnated with the cold which the corpse had communicated to it, had rubbed across his face. The guide continued. This was his plan. He assumed that the dead were buried at the Chateau d'Iffend, since he was sure they wouldn't go to the expense of providing coffins for prisoners. He planned to push his way up out of the ground. But unfortunately there was a custom in the prison which ruined his plan. They didn't bury the dead. They only tied a cannonball to their feet and threw them into the sea. And that's what was done to the young man. The next day they found the priest's body in the young man's bed and guessed everything, especially when the man assigned to throw the body into the sea told something they hadn't dared tell before, that when they threw the body they heard a terrible cry which was smothered as soon as the body hit the water. The Count breathed heavily and anguish clutched at his heart. "No," he thought. "I began to doubt only because I was beginning to forget, but here the wound in my heart opens again and the thirst for vengeance returns." Then he said to the guide, "Was anything ever heard of the prisoner again?" "No, never. He was thrown from a height of about 50 feet and he hit the water feet first, so the weight of the cannonball must have dragged him down to the bottom of the sea immediately. Poor man. Do you pity him?" "Yes, of course. Although he died in his own element." "What do you mean?" "They say he was a sailor who was in prison for Bonapartism." "What was his name?" "He was known only as Number 34. "Villefort, Villefort," thought Monte Cristo. "That's what you must have told yourself many times when my ghost came to trouble your sleep." "Would you like to see the rest of the prison, sir?" asked the guide. "Yes, especially if you'll show me the poor priest's cell." "Come with me, then." "Just a moment," said Monte Cristo. "I'd like to take one last look at the cell." "That suits me very well," said the guide, "because I've forgotten the key to the priest's cell." "Go and get it, then." "I'll leave you the torch." "No, take it with you." "But you won't have any light in here." "I can see in the dark." "You're like Number 34, then." "They say he could see a pin in the darkest corner of his cell. It took him 10 years to accomplish that." thought Monte Cristo. The guide walked away, taking the torch with him. The Count had told the truth. After being in the darkness for only a few seconds, he could see everything with perfect clarity. "Yes," he said to himself, "this is the stone I used to sit on, and there's a trace of the blood that flowed from my forehead one day when I tried to crush my head against the wall. Those figures, yes, I remember them. I made them one day when I calculated my father's age to see if I would find him still alive, and Mercedes' age to see if I would find her still free. I had a moment of hope when I finished those calculations. I wasn't taking hunger and infidelity into account." A bitter laugh burst from the Count's lips. As in a dream, he had just seen his father being taken to the grave, and Mercedes walking to the altar. His attention was caught by an inscription on the opposite wall. "Oh God, preserve my memory." Yes, that was my only prayer toward the end of my imprisonment, he thought. I no longer asked for freedom. I asked only to keep my memory because I was afraid I might go mad and forget. But you preserved my memory, oh God, and I haven't forgotten. Thank you, my God, thank you. Just then the light of a torch was reflected on the walls. The guide was returning. Monte Cristo went out to meet him. "Follow me," said the guide. He led the Count through an underground corridor to another cell. Monte Cristo saw the remains of the bed on which the Abbé Faria had died. At this sight, instead of the anguish he had felt in his own cell, his heart swelled with a feeling of affection and gratitude, and tears welled up in his eyes. "This is the mad priest's cell," said the guide. Pointing to an opening which had remained unclosed, he added, "That's where the young man came in to see him." Judging from the appearance of the stone, a learned man said the two prisoners communicated with each other for about 10 years. Those 10 years must have seemed terribly long to them. Poor men! Dantes took several 20-franc coins from his pocket and handed them to the man who had just pitied him for the second time without knowing him. The guide accepted them, thinking he was being given only some small change. But then, looking at them by the light of his torch, he recognized their true value. "You've made a mistake, sir." "What do you mean?" "These are gold coins you gave me." "I know that. You intended to give them to me?" "Yes." The guide looked at Monte Cristo in astonishment. "Sir," he said, "I don't understand your generosity." "It's not too difficult to understand. You see, I, too, was once a sailor, so I was particularly touched by the story you told me. Well, then, since you're so generous, sir, I ought to offer you something also." "What do you have to offer me?" "Something connected with the story I just told you." "Really?" cried the Count eagerly. "What is it?" "Well, I'll tell you. One day I said to myself, you can always find something in a cell where a prisoner lived for 15 years, and I began to tap on the walls. After a while I discovered a hollow sound near the head of the bed and under the hearth. I lifted out the stones and I found a rope ladder and some tools," cried the Count. "How did you know that?" asked the guide in surprise. "I didn't know it. I only guessed it. That's usually the sort of thing a prisoner hides in his cell. Do you still have them?" "No, sir. I sold them to visitors. But I do have something else." "What is it?" asked the Count impatiently. "I still have a sort of book written on strips of cloth." "Oh!" cried Monte Cristo. "You still have that book?" "I don't know if it's a book, but I still have it." "Go get it for me." The guide left the cell. Monte Cristo knelt reverently before the remains of that bed which death had transformed into an altar for him. "Oh, my second father," he said, "you gave me freedom, knowledge and wealth, you who, like beings of a superior order, had the knowledge of good and evil. If, after the transfiguration of the body, there still remains something animate in the places where we have loved or suffered deeply, noble heart, supreme intellect, profound soul, give me some sign, I beg you, take away this doubt, which, if it changes to a conviction, will also become remorse." The Count bowed his head and joined his hands. "Here it is, sir," said a voice behind him. He started and turned around. The guide was holding out to him those strips of cloth on which the Abbé Faria had poured out all the treasures of his knowledge and wisdom. They formed the manuscript of his great work on the monarchy in Italy. The Count seized them eagerly. The first thing his eyes fell on was the epigraph, "Thou shalt tear out the teeth of the dragon and trample the lions underfoot, thus saith the Lord." "Ah!" cried Monte Cristo. "There's my answer. Thank you, father, thank you." He drew out of his pocket a small wallet containing 10 banknotes of 1,000 francs each. "Here," he said to the guide, "take this wallet." "Are you giving it to me?" "Yes, but on condition that you won't look inside it till after I've gone." Pressing the precious relic to his chest, Monte Cristo hurried out of the dungeon and went back to the boat. "Back to Marseille," he said. As he sailed away from the somber prison, he kept his eyes fixed on it and said to himself, "Woe to those who put me into that wretched dungeon, and to those who forgot I was there." The victory was complete. The Count of Monte Cristo had twice vanquished doubt. After stepping ashore, he went to the cemetery, where he found Maximilian. 10 years earlier, Monte Cristo had also made a pious pilgrimage to that cemetery, but, having returned to France with all his millions, he had been unable to find the grave of his father, who had died of hunger. Maximilian's father had fared better. Having died in the arms of his children, he had been laid to rest by them beside his wife, who had preceded him by 2 years. 2 large slabs of marble with their names inscribed on them had been placed side by side within a little enclosure formed by an iron railing and shaded by 4 cypress trees. Maximilian was leaning against one of those trees and staring dully at the 2 tombstones. His grief was profound, almost overwhelming. "Maximilian," said the Count, "you told me during the journey that you wanted to stay here in Marseille for several days. Is that still your wish?" "I have no more wishes, Count, but it seems to me I'd wait a little less painfully here than anywhere else." "Good. I'm going to leave you for a while, but you'll still keep your word, won't you?" The young man let his head fall to his chest. "You have my promise," he said, after a moment of silence. "But remember, I'll expect you on the Isle of Monte Cristo on the 5th of October. On the 4th, a yacht will be waiting for you in the harbor of Bastia. The name of the yacht will be the Eurus. Give your name to the captain and he'll take you to me. I'll do as I promised, Count, but remember that on the 5th of October. I've told you 20 times that if you still want to die on that day, I'll help you myself. And now, goodbye." "You're leaving me?" "Yes, I have something to do in Italy. I'm leaving right away. The steamer is waiting for me. Will you come with me to the harbor?" "I'm at your disposal, Count." Maximilian accompanied Monte Cristo to the harbor. Smoke was already pouring out of the stacks of the steamboat when they arrived. It set out soon afterward. An hour later it had almost vanished on the eastern horizon. Chapter 70. At the same time as the Count's steamboat was disappearing behind Cape Morgiou, a man had just passed the little town of Acquapendente, on the road from Florence to Rome. The accent in which he spoke to the coachman stamped him as a Frenchman, although the only Italian words he knew were musical terms. "Allegro," he called out to the coachman at every rise in the road, and "Moderato" at every descent. We might mention that these 2 words made him the object of much laughter. On reaching La Storda, where one can see Rome in the distance, this traveler felt none of the enthusiastic curiosity which moves most foreigners to stand up in their carriages to try to see the famous dome of St. Peter's, which one can distinguish before anything else. Instead, he merely took a wallet from his pocket, drew out a piece of paper, unfolded it with a careful attention which resembled respect, folded it again and said to himself, "Good. I still have it." The carriage went through the Porta del Popolo, turned left and drew up in front of a hotel. Our old friend Signer Pastrini received the traveler in the doorway with his hat in his hand. The traveler alighted, ordered a good dinner and asked for the address of the firm of Thompson and French. When the new arrival left the hotel with the inevitable cicerone, a man stepped out from the crowd of curious bystanders and, unnoticed by the traveler and apparently unnoticed by his guide, began to follow them. The Frenchman was in such a hurry to call on the firm of Thompson and French that he had not taken the time to wait for the horses to be harnessed. The carriage was to wait for him outside the door of the firm. The Frenchman entered, leaving his guide in the antechamber. The man who had followed them also entered. The Frenchman rang the doorbell and walked into the outer office. His shadow did likewise. "Messrs. Thompson and French?" asked the stranger. A servant stood up at a sign from a confidential clerk, solemn guardian of the first office. "Whom shall I announce?" asked the servant. "Baron Danglars," replied the Frenchman. A door opened. The servant and the Baron walked through it, while the man who had entered with Danglars sat down in the waiting room. The clerk continued to write for 5 minutes or so, during which the man sitting in the waiting room remained silent and motionless. Then the clerk's pen ceased to scratch on the paper. He raised his head, looked carefully around the room and said, "Ah, here you are, Peppino." "Yes," was the laconic reply. "You found out something good about that fat man?" "I can't take any credit for it. We were notified in advance." "So you know why he came here?" "Of course. He came here to draw money. All we need to know now is how much. We'll tell you that in a little while, my friend." "Very good. But don't give us false information, as you did for that Russian prince the other day. You told us 30,000 francs and we found only 22,000. You must not have searched well enough." Luigi Vampa searched him in person. "In that case, he must either have paid off some debts or spent the money before you got to him." "Yes, I suppose that's possible." "It's not possible, it's sure. But let me go make my observations or the Frenchman will transact his business without my knowing the exact figure." Peppino nodded. Taking a rosary from his pocket, he began to mumble a prayer while the clerk disappeared through the same door which had admitted the servant and the Baron. 10 minutes later the clerk reappeared, beaming. "Well?" asked Peppino. "Be on the alert. It's a magnificent sum. 5 million, isn't it?" "Yes." "How did you know the figure?" "On a receipt from His Excellency the Count of Monte Cristo." "That's right," cried the clerk. "How are you so well informed? I told you we were notified in advance. Then why did you ask me for information?" "To make sure it was the right man." "He's the man you want, all right. SSH. Here he comes now." The clerk picked up his pen and Peppino his rosary. The former was writing and the latter was praying when the door opened. Danglars, with a radiant smile on his face, was accompanied by the banker, who showed him to the door. Peppino walked out behind Danglars. As had been arranged, a carriage was waiting for Danglars in front of the offices of the firm. He climbed into it while his cicerone held the door open for him. The cicerone closed the door and seated himself beside the driver. Peppino climbed up on the rear seat. "Would you like to go to St. Peter's Cathedral, Excellency?" asked the cicerone. "What for?" replied the Baron. "Why, to look at it. I didn't come to Rome to look. Where would you like to go, then, Excellency?" "Back to the hotel. Casa Pastrini," said the cicerone to the driver. 10 minutes later the Baron was back in his apartment at the hotel and Peppino had settled down on a bench in front of the hotel. Danglars was tired, happy and sleepy. He put his wallet under his pillow and went to sleep. Although he went to bed early, he woke up late the next day, for he had slept badly for 5 or 6 consecutive nights, when he slept at all. He ate a hearty breakfast and, caring little about seeing the beauties of the eternal city, ordered his post horses for noon. But he had reckoned without the formalities of the police and the laziness of the master of the post. The horses did not arrive until 2 o'clock, and the cicerone did not bring back his passport until 3. "Which road?" asked the driver in Italian. "The Ancona road," replied the Baron. Signor Pastrini translated the question and the answer, and the carriage set out at a gallop. Danglars intended to pass through Venice and then go on to Vienna, which he had been told was a city of pleasure and in which he planned to settle down permanently. He was scarcely 3 leagues outside of Rome when night began to fall. He asked the driver how far it was to the next town. "Non capisco," replied the driver. Danglars nodded in a way which signified, "Very well." The carriage continued on its way. "I'll stop over at the first relay station," said Danglars to himself. For 10 minutes he thought about his wife, whom he had left behind in Paris. Then for 10 minutes he thought about his daughter, who was wandering somewhere in the world with Mademoiselle d'Armilly. He devoted 10 more minutes to his creditors and the way in which he would use their money. Then, having nothing else to think about, he closed his eyes and went to sleep. The carriage stopped. Danglars opened his eyes and looked out the window, expecting to find himself in some town, or at least in some village. But he saw nothing except a sort of ruin and 3 or 4 men moving back and forth like shadows. He waited for the driver who had just completed his relay to come and ask to be paid, but the horses were replaced without anyone's coming to him to ask for money. Danglars, astonished, opened the door, but a vigorous hand immediately pushed it shut again and the carriage set off. The Baron, astounded, woke up completely. "Hey there, mio caro," he called out to the driver, using another bit of Italian he remembered from hearing his daughter sing duets with Prince Cavalcanti. But mio caro did not answer. Danglars opened the window, put his head through it and shouted, "Where are we going?" "Dentro la testa," replied an imperious voice, accompanied by a threatening gesture. Danglars understood that "dentro la testa" meant, "Put your head inside." He was making rapid progress in Italian. He obeyed, not without uneasiness. This uneasiness grew from minute to minute until his mind was filled with a number of thoughts well fitted to arouse a traveler's interest, especially a traveler in Danglars' situation. Then he saw a man wrapped in a cloak galloping beside the right-hand door of the carriage. "It must be a gendarme," he said to himself. "Can the French authorities have sent a telegraphic message to the Roman authorities about me?" He resolved to put an end to his uncertainty. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "Dentro la testa," replied the same voice, in the same tone of menace. Danglars looked out the left-hand window and saw another man galloping beside the carriage. "No doubt about it," he said to himself. "I've been caught." He leaned back in his seat, this time not to sleep, but to think. A moment later the moon rose. He looked out and saw the great aqueducts he had noticed at the beginning of his journey, but this time they were on his left instead of on his right. He realized that the carriage had turned around and was taking him back to Rome. "Oh," he murmured. "They've obtained extradition." Finally he saw a dark mass which the carriage seemed about to crash into, but at the last moment it turned and ran alongside the mass, which Danglars recognized as one of the ramparts surrounding Rome. "We're not going back into the city, so it can't be the police who've caught me," thought Danglars. "My God! Could it be?" And he remembered the interesting stories of Roman bandits, so little believed in Paris, which Albert de Morcerf had told to his wife and daughter. "Maybe they're robbers," he thought. The carriage stopped and the left-hand door opened. "Sunday," ordered a voice. Danglars climbed out of the carriage instantly. He could not yet speak Italian, but he already understood it. More dead than alive, the Baron looked around him. He was surrounded by 4 men, not counting the driver. "Di qua," said one of the four men, turning down a narrow path. Danglars followed his guide without argument. He had no need to turn around in order to know that he was being followed by the three other men. However, it seemed to him that those men stopped and posted themselves as sentinels at approximately equal intervals. After walking for 10 minutes or so without exchanging a single word with his guide, he found himself between a small hill and a clump of high grass. Three men stood silent, forming a triangle of which he was the center. "Avanti!" said the same curt, imperious voice. This time Danglars understood not only by word but by gesture, for the man behind him pushed him forward so energetically that he stumbled against his guide. This guide was our friend Peppino, who led the way along a twisting route which only a ferret or a lizard could have recognized as a path. Peppino stopped before a large rock which was half open like an eyelid, then disappeared into it. The voice and gestures of the man behind Danglars ordered him to do likewise. He could no longer doubt that he had fallen into the hands of Roman bandits. Two other men descended behind him and, pushing him whenever he happened to stop, brought him down a gently sloping corridor to an open space of sinister appearance. The walls, hollowed out into sepulchres placed one above the other, seemed, in the midst of the white stone, to open deep, black eyes like those of a skull. "Who goes there?" called out the sentry. "Friend," replied Peppino. "Where's the chief?" "In there," said the sentry, pointing into a large room hollowed out of the rock. Peppino took Danglars by the coat collar and pulled him through an opening which resembled a door and which led into the room in which the chief apparently lived. "Is this the man?" asked the chief, who had been attentively reading the life of Alexander and Plutarch. "Yes." "Show him to me." At this rather impertinent order, Peppino moved the torch near Danglars' face so abruptly that the Baron had to step back quickly to keep from having his eyebrows singed. His face wore an expression of utter terror. "This man is tired," said the chief. "Take him to his bed." "Oh," thought Danglars, "that bed is probably one of those sepulchres carved into the wall." He groaned and followed his guide. He did not try to cry out or beg for mercy, for he no longer had any strength, any will or feelings. He stumbled against a step. Realizing that there was a staircase in front of him, he instinctively lowered his head in order not to strike his forehead and found himself in a cell hollowed out of solid rock. It was clean, though bare, and dry, although located far underground. In one corner there was a bed made of dried grass and covered with goatskins. When Danglars noticed it, he saw in it the radiant symbol of his salvation. "Thank God!" he exclaimed. "It's a real bed." "Ecco," said the guide. He pushed Danglars into the cell and closed the door. A bolt snapped shut. Danglars was a prisoner. And even if there had been no bolt, one would have had to be St. Peter himself, guided by an angel from heaven, to pass through the bandits who held the catacombs of St. Sebastian, camped around their chief, whom the reader has certainly recognized as the famous Luigi Vampa. Danglars had also recognized this bandit, in whose existence he had refused to believe when Albert de Morcerf had tried to naturalize him in France. Not only did he recognize Vampa, but also the cell in which Morcerf had been imprisoned. In all probability it was the lodging usually given to strangers. These reflections restored his peace of mind to a certain extent. Since they had not killed him immediately, the bandits must not intend to kill him at all. They had no doubt seized him to rob him, but, since he had only a few francs on him, they would hold him for ransom. He remembered that Morcerf had been held for something like 24,000 francs. Since he considered himself to have a much more important appearance than Morcerf, he fixed his own probable ransom at double that sum. He would still have over 5,000,000 francs left. With an amount like that, one could manage to get along anywhere in the world. Almost certain, therefore, of being able to extricate himself from his situation, since it was unheard of for a man to be held for a ransom of 5,000,000 francs. Danglars lay down on his bed and, after turning over on it 2 or 3 times, went to sleep with the tranquility of the hero whose story Luigi Vampa was studying. Chapter 71. The first thing Danglars did on awakening the next morning was to breathe in order to assure himself that he had not been wounded. This was a means he had found in Don Quixote, the only book he had read of which he remembered anything. No, he said to himself, they've neither killed me nor wounded me. But have they robbed me? He quickly put his hands into his pockets. The 2,000 francs he had set aside for his journey from Rome to Venice was still in his trousers pocket, and the wallet containing his letter of credit for 5,050,000 francs was still in his coat pocket. What strange bandits! He thought. Well, I was right, they're going to hold me for ransom. Should he demand an explanation from the bandits, or should he wait patiently for them to make the first move? The second alternative seemed more prudent. He waited. Meanwhile a sentry had been posted before his door. At 8 o'clock the sentry was relieved by another. Danglars was curious to see by whom he was being guarded. He had noticed that rays of light, not daylight, but lamplight, filtered through the cracks in the door. He peeked through one of those cracks just as the bandit was taking a drink of brandy, which, thanks to the leather bottle in which it was contained, gave forth an odor which was extremely unpleasant to Danglars. Phew! He exclaimed, retreating to the other side of his cell. At noon the man with the brandy was replaced by another sentry. His curiosity aroused once more, Danglars put his eye to the crack again. His new guard was a muscular bandit, a Goliath with large eyes, thick lips, a flattened nose and red hair which hung down to his shoulders in twisted strands that looked like so many vipers. "Oh," said Danglars to himself, "this one looks more like an ogre than a human being. But I'm too old and tough to make good eating." He still had enough self-assurance to allow him to jest. At the same moment, as though to offer proof that he was not an ogre, his guard sat down in front of the door and drew from his pouch a loaf of black bread, several onions and some cheese. "May the devil take me if I understand how anyone could eat such filth," thought Danglars as he glanced at the bandit's dinner through the crack. He went back and sat down on his goatskins, which reminded him of the odor of the first sentry's brandy. But there is a great deal of eloquence in the invitations which even the coarser substances address to an empty stomach. Danglars suddenly felt that his own stomach was bottomless. The man then seemed less ugly to him, the bread less black and the cheese less stale. He went over to the door and knocked on it. "Che cosa?" asked the bandit. "I think it's about time someone thought about giving me something to eat," said Danglars, drumming on the door with his fingers. But, whether because he did not understand or because he had been given no orders concerning Danglars' food, the giant turned back to his lunch. Danglars felt his pride humiliated and, not wishing to compromise himself any further with such a brute, he lay down again on his goatskins and said nothing more. 4 hours went by. The giant was replaced by another bandit. Danglars, whose stomach was by now churning in a frightful manner, stood up quietly, placed his eye before a crack in the door and recognized the intelligent face of his guide, Peppino. "Let's see if this one is a little easier to deal with than the other one," said Danglars to himself, knocking politely on the door. "Coming," said the bandit, who had come to speak fluent French from frequenting Signor Passarini's hotel. As he opened the door, Danglars recognized him as the man who had shouted so furiously, "Dentro la testa!" But this was no time for recriminations. On the contrary, he put on his most agreeable expression and said, with a gracious smile, "Excuse me, but can't I have something to eat?" "What?" exclaimed Peppino. "Are you by any chance hungry, Excellency?" "By any chance is a charming expression when I haven't eaten anything for 24 hours, thought Danglars. Then he said aloud, "Yes, I'm hungry. In fact, I'm very hungry." "And when would you like to eat, Excellency?" asked Peppino. Immediately, if possible. Nothing could be simpler, said Peppino. You can have anything you like here, by paying for it, of course, as is customary among all honest Christians. Of course, said Danglars, although, to tell the truth, it seems to me that people who seize you and imprison you ought at least to feed their prisoners. That's not the custom, Excellency. That's not a very good reason, but I'm willing to accept it, said Danglars, who hoped to win over his guard by his amiability. What would you like to eat, Excellency? You have only to give me your order. You have a kitchen here? Why, of course. And cooks? Excellent cooks. Well, then, bring me a chicken, some fish, meat, anything, as long as I eat. As you like, Excellency. Shall we say a chicken? Yes, a chicken. Peppino stood up and called out at the top of his lungs, a chicken for His Excellency. A few moments later a slender young man appeared carrying a chicken on a silver platter. Here you are, Excellency, said Peppino, taking the chicken from the hands of the young bandit and setting it down on the dilapidated table which, along with a stool and the bed, formed the only furnishings in the cell. Danglars asked for a knife and fork. Certainly, Excellency, said Peppino, offering him a wooden fork and a small knife with a blunted point. Danglars took the fork in one hand and the knife in the other and set about cutting up the chicken. Excuse me, Excellency, said Peppino, placing a hand on the banker's shoulder, but here it's customary to pay before eating. Aha! Thought Danglars. I'm sure they're going to overcharge me royally, but we might as well do things in the grand manner. I've always heard of how cheap things are in Italy. A chicken must be worth about 12 sous in Rome. He tossed a 20-franc coin to Peppino. Peppino picked up the coin and Danglars moved his knife toward the chicken. Just a moment, Excellency, said Peppino, but you still owe me something. I was certainly right about being overcharged, thought Danglars. Then, making up his mind to accept the extortion, he said, and how much more do I owe you for this emaciated chicken? Only 99,980 francs, Excellency. Danglars' eyes opened wide at this gigantic pleasantry. Very funny, he said as he turned back to his chicken. But Peppino stopped him and held out his hand. What? Said Danglars. You're not joking? We never joke, Excellency, replied Peppino seriously. 100,000 francs for this chicken? You have no idea how hard it is to raise poultry in these cursed caves, Excellency. Come, come, said Danglars. This is all very amusing, but I'm hungry, so let me eat. Here's another 20 francs for you, my friend. That leaves only 99,960 francs that you owe me, said Peppino. With a little patience we'll finally get there. Never, said Danglars, angered by Peppino's persistence in maintaining the jest. You can go to the devil. You don't know with whom you're dealing. Peppino made a sign and the young man picked up the chicken and carried it away. Danglars threw himself on his bed as Peppino closed the door and locked it. His stomach felt so empty that it seemed to him he would never be able to fill it, but he waited for another half an hour. Then he went back to the door and said, "Don't keep me in suspense any longer. Tell me what you want from me." "But it's up to you to tell us what you want from us, Excellency," replied Peppino. "Give us your orders and we'll carry them out." "First open the door," said Danglars. Peppino did so. "I want to eat," cried Danglars. "Are you hungry, Excellency? You know very well I'm hungry. What would you like to eat? A piece of bread, since your chickens are so precious." "Bread!" shouted Peppino. The young man brought a small loaf of bread. "How much is it?" asked Danglars. 99,960 francs. You've already paid 40 francs in advance. 100,000 francs for a loaf of bread? That's right, Excellency. But you wanted to charge me the same amount for a chicken. We don't serve a gras la carte here, Excellency. No matter what you eat, it's always the same price. You still insist on your stupid joke. Why don't you admit you want me to starve to death and get it over with? Not at all, Excellency. It's you who want to commit suicide. You can eat if you pay for it. But what can I pay with, you idiot? Cried Danglars, beside himself. Do you think I carry around 100,000 francs in my pocket? You have 5,050,000 francs in your pocket, Excellency, said Peppino. That's enough for 50 chickens at 100,000 francs each and half a chicken at 50,000. Danglars shuddered. His eyes had just been opened. It was still a joke, but he had finally understood it. We might add that it no longer seemed as silly to him as it had before. All right, he said, if I give you 100,000 francs, will you let me eat all I like? Of course. But how can I give it to you? Asked Danglars, beginning to breathe more freely. It's quite simple. You have an account with the firm of Thompson and French in Rome. Give us a draft on them and our banker will take the money for us. Danglars took the pen and paper which Peppino handed to him, wrote out the draft and signed it. Here's your draft, he said, and here's your chicken. Danglars sighed as he cut up the chicken. It seemed quite lean to him for such a large sum. Peppino examined the draft carefully and put it into his pocket. Chapter 72. The next day Danglars was hungry again, but he did not believe he would have to make any further expenditures that day. Like the thrifty man he was, he had hidden away half of his chicken in a corner of his cell. But as soon as he ate it he was thirsty. He had not taken that into account. He struggled against his thirst until he felt his tongue cleaving to the roof of his mouth. Then, unable to resist any longer, he called out. The sentry opened the door. It was a new face. Thinking it would be better to deal with an old acquaintance, Danglars asked for Peppino. Here I am, Excellency, said Peppino, presenting himself with an eagerness which struck Danglars as a good omen. What can I do for you? I'd like something to drink, said the prisoner. As you know, Excellency, wine is extremely expensive in the countryside around Rome. Bring me some water, then, said Danglars, seeking to parry the blow. Oh, water is even more scarce than wine, Excellency. There's such a drought this year. I see we're about to begin our little joke again, said Danglars. The poor man forced himself to smile as he said this, but he felt beads of perspiration break out on his forehead. Come, my friend, he continued, seeing that Peppino remained impassive, I'm asking you for a glass of wine. Will you refuse me? We don't sell by the glass, Excellency, replied Peppino gravely. Then bring me a bottle. What kind? The cheapest. They're all the same price. And what is that price? 25,000 francs a bottle. Why don't you tell me you intend to take everything I own? Said Danglars bitterly. That will be quicker than devouring me piecemeal. That may be what the chief plans to do, said Peppino. Who's the chief? The man to whom you were taken yesterday. Where is he? Here. I'd like to see him. Certainly. A moment later Luigi Vampa stood before Danglars. You sent for me? He asked. Are you the leader of the men who brought me here? Yes, Excellency. What ransom do you want from me? Tell me. Why, we want the 5,000,000 francs you have on you. Danglars felt his heart contract convulsively. That's all I have in the world, he said, and it's the remainder of an immense fortune. If you take it away from me, take my life away from me also. We are forbidden to shed your blood, Excellency. By whom are you forbidden? By the man we obey. You obey someone, then? Yes. And does he obey anyone? Yes. Whom? God. Danglars remained thoughtful for a moment. I don't understand, he said. That's possible. Why were you ordered to treat me this way? I have no idea. Come now, said Danglars. "Would you like 1,000,000 francs?" "No." 2,000,000? "No." 3,000,000? 4? "I'll give you 4,000,000 if you'll let me go free." "Why do you offer us 4,000,000 for something that's worth 5?" asked Vampa. "Take it all, then, and kill me," cried Danglars. "Calm yourself, Excellency, or you'll give yourself such an appetite that you'll eat 1,000,000 francs worth of food a day. Be more economical." "But what will happen when I run out of money?" cried Danglars furiously. "You'll be hungry." "I'll be hungry?" said Danglars, turning pale. "Probably," replied Vampa phlegmatically. "You say you don't want to kill me?" "That's right. And yet you want me to starve to death? That's not the same thing." "All right, you scoundrels," cried Danglars, "I'll upset your infamous plans. Since I'm going to die anyway, I'd just as soon get it over with immediately. Make me suffer, torture me, kill me, but you won't have my signature again." "As you like, Excellency," said Vampa. He walked out of the cell. Danglars threw himself on his bed. Who were those men? Who was their invisible leader? What did they intend to do to him? Why, when they released all their other captives for ransom, was he alone refused that privilege? For what was perhaps the first time in his long career, Danglars thought of death with mingled longing and dread. His determination not to sign lasted for 2 days, after which he asked for food and offered to pay 1,000,000 francs for it. His captors served him a magnificent supper and took his 1,000,000. From then on, having suffered so much and not wishing to expose himself to further suffering, the wretched prisoner submitted to all demands. 12 days later, after having eaten a dinner worthy of his days of good fortune, he added up his accounts and found that he had signed so many drafts that he now had only 50,000 francs left. Then he had a strange reaction for a man who had just abandoned 5,000,000 francs. He resolved to keep that 50,000 francs at any cost, and he began to have visions of hope verging on madness. He who had forgotten God so long ago now began to tell himself that God occasionally worked miracles. The catacombs might cave in. The police might discover the bandits' retreat and rescue him. In that case he would have 50,000 francs left, and that was enough to keep a man from dying of hunger. He begged God to allow him to keep that 50,000 francs, and he wept as he prayed. For 3 days the name of God was constantly on Danglars' lips, if not in his heart. By the 4th day he was no longer a man, but a living corpse. He had picked up the last crumb of his former meals and had begun to devour the matting which covered the floor. He begged Peppino to give him something to eat. He offered him 1,000 francs for a crust of bread. Peppino did not answer. On the 5th day he called for Vampa and said to him, "Take the last of my money and let me lie here, in this cave. I'm not asking for freedom. I'm only asking to live." "Are you really suffering?" asked Vampa. "Yes, I'm suffering. I'm suffering horribly. And yet there have been men who suffered more than you." "I don't think so." "Yes, those who died of hunger." Danglars groaned and said, "Yes, it's true, there have been others who suffered more than I, but at least they were martyrs." "Do you repent, at least?" said a deep, solemn voice which made Danglars' hair stand on end. His weakened eyes saw a man standing behind Vampa, wrapped in a cloak and half hidden in the shadow of a stone pillar. "Of what must I repent?" stammered Danglars. "Of the evil you have done," said the voice. "Oh, yes, I repent. I repent," cried Danglars, beating his breast with his emaciated fists. "Then I forgive you," said the man, throwing aside his cloak and stepping forward into the light. "The Count of Monte Cristo," gasped Danglars, now as pale from terror as he had been from hunger and misery a moment before. "You're mistaken. I'm not the Count of Monte Cristo." "Who are you, then?" "I'm the man you betrayed and dishonored, the man whose fancy you prostituted, the man on whom you trod on the way to fortune, the man whose father you caused to die of hunger, the man you condemned to die of hunger but who now forgives you because he himself needs to be forgiven. I am Edmond Dantes." Danglars uttered a cry and fell to the floor. "Stand up," said the Count. "Your life will be spared. Your two accomplices weren't so lucky. One of them is insane and the other is dead. Keep the 50,000 francs you have left. I make you a gift of it. As for the 5 million you stole from the hospitals, I've already given back the money anonymously. And now, eat and drink. You'll be my guest this evening. Vampa, when this man has recovered his strength, release him." Danglars remained prostrate as the Count walked away. When he raised his head he saw nothing but a shadow vanishing down the corridor. As the Count had ordered, Vampa brought Danglars the best wine and the finest fruits of Italy. Then he drove him away in his carriage and abandoned him on the road. Danglars remained there till morning, not knowing where he was. When daylight dawned, he saw that he was near a brook. Being thirsty, he dragged himself over to it. As he bent down to drink, he noticed that his hair had turned white. Chapter 73. It was toward 6 o'clock in the evening. A light yacht, pure and graceful of form, sailed swiftly along despite the fact that there scarcely seemed to be enough wind to ruff the hair of the young girl. Standing in the bow, a tall young man of dark complexion watched land approaching in a dark cone-shaped mass, rising out of the sea like an immense Catalan hat. "Is that the Isle of Monte Cristo?" he asked in a voice permeated with deep sadness. "Yes, Excellency," replied the captain of the yacht. A few minutes later they saw a flash of fire from the island and the sound of a shot reached their ears. "There's the signal, Excellency," said the captain. "Would you like to answer it yourself?" "Yes." The captain handed a loaded carbine to the young man, who raised it slowly and fired a shot into the air. 10 minutes later the yacht was anchored and a skiff had been put over the side with 4 rowers and a pilot in it. The young man climbed into it and stood in the stern with his arms crossed. All 8 oars plunged into the sea at once without splashing a single drop of water. The skiff began to glide rapidly through the waves. A short time later it struck against a bottom of fine sand. "Excellency," said the pilot, "climb up on the shoulders of 2 of our men and let them carry you ashore." The young man replied to this invitation with a gesture of complete indifference, put his legs over the side of the boat and slid into the water, which rose up to his waist. He began to walk toward shore, following 2 of the sailors, who chose the most solid footing for him. When he had reached dry ground, the young man looked around for someone to show him his way, for it had grown quite dark. Then a hand was placed on his shoulder and a voice made him start. "Hello, Maximilian," said the voice. "Thank you for being punctual." "Ah, it's you, Count," said Maximilian, shaking Monte Cristo's hand. "Yes, I'm as punctual as you. But you're wet to the skin, my friend. You'll have to change clothes. Come, I've had lodgings prepared for you in which you'll forget your fatigue and cold." "Count," said Maximilian in a voice that was at once firm and gentle, "I've come to you to die in the arms of a friend. There are still people I love in this world. I love my sister Julie and I love her husband Emmanuel. But I need someone who will open strong arms to me and smile at me during my last moments of life." Julie would burst into tears and faint. I'd see her suffer and I've already suffered enough. Emmanuel would snatch my weapon from my hand and fill the house with his cries. But I have your word, Count. You'll lead me gently and tenderly to the gates of death, won't you? "My friend," said Monte Cristo, "I still have one doubt. Could you have so little strength that you take pride in displaying your sorrow?" "No," said Maximilian, "my heart is beating neither more strongly nor more slowly than usual. I've simply come to the end of the road and I won't go any further. Oh, Count, I'll be so glad to rest in the arms of death." Seeing that Monte Cristo made no answer, he went on, You named the 5th of October as the end of the delay you asked me for. Today is the 5th of October. He took out his watch. It's 9 o'clock. I have 3 more hours to live, so be it, said Monte Cristo. Come. Maximilian followed the Count mechanically and was already inside the grotto before he noticed where he was. He found a carpet under his feet. A door opened, an odor of perfume enveloped him and his eyes were struck by a bright light. He stopped hesitantly, mistrusting the enervating delights that surrounded him. Monte Cristo pulled him gently and said, "Why shouldn't we spend these last 3 hours like those ancient Romans who, condemned to death by Nero, sat down at a table crowned with flowers and breathed in death with the perfume of heliotropes and roses?" Maximilian smiled. "As you like," he said. "Death is still death, still the absence of life and therefore of pain." He sat down. Monte Cristo sat down in front of him. They were in a sumptuous dining room in which marble statues held on their heads baskets filled with flowers and fruit. Maximilian looked vaguely at everything around him. "Now I understand," he said, "why you asked me to meet you here on this deserted island in this underground palace, the sepulchre that a pharaoh would envy. It's because you love me, isn't it, Count? It's because you want to give me a gentle death. A death without agony, a death that will allow me to fade away with Valentine's name on my lips and your hand in mine." "You've guessed rightly, Maximilian," said the Count simply. "That's my intention." "Thank you. The thought that my suffering will be ended by tomorrow is sweet to me." "You have no regrets?" "No. Not even about leaving me?" asked the Count with deep emotion. Maximilian was silent. A tear welled up in his eyes. "What?" exclaimed the Count. "There's something on earth you'll regret leaving and you're still going to die? Don't say any more, Count, I beg you," said Maximilian feebly. "Don't prolong my agony." The Count believed Maximilian was weakening. This belief brought back the horrible doubt which he had overcome once before in the Château d'If. "I'm seeking to bring happiness to this man," he thought. "I regard this restitution as a weight thrown into the scale to balance the evil I have done. But what if I were mistaken? What if this man weren't unhappy enough to deserve happiness? What would happen to me, who can forget evil only by remembering good?" Then he said aloud, "Your grief is overwhelming, Maximilian, I can see that. But you still believe in God and you wouldn't want to risk the salvation of your soul." Maximilian smiled sadly. "You know I'm not given to histrionics," he said, "but I swear to you that my soul no longer belongs to me." "Listen to me, Maximilian," said the Count. "As you know, I have no living relatives. I've come to regard you as my son. I'd sacrifice my own life to save my son's, so I'd certainly sacrifice my fortune." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you want to leave life because you don't know all the enjoyments a great fortune can bring. I possess nearly 100 million francs. I give it all to you. With a fortune like that you can have anything you want. If you're ambitious, all careers are open to you. Stir up the world, change its face, abandon yourself to mad ideas, be a criminal if you must, but live." "You've given me your word, Count," replied Maximilian coldly, "and it's now 11:30. "Maximilian, could you do that before my eyes, in my house? Then let me leave you," said Maximilian gloomily. He stood up. Monte Cristo's face brightened at these words. "Very well," he said, "you want to die and your will is inflexible. Yes, you're profoundly unhappy and, as you say, only a miracle could cure you. Sit down, Maximilian, and wait." Maximilian obeyed. Monte Cristo went over to a cabinet, unlocked it and took out a small silver box, which he placed on the table. Then he opened it and took out a still smaller gold box whose lid snapped open by means of a hidden spring. This box contained an oily, semi-solid substance whose color was indefinable due to the reflections of the polished gold of the box and the sapphires, rubies and emeralds with which it was embellished. The Count took out a small quantity of the substance with a spoon and offered it to Maximilian, gazing at him steadfastly. At that moment the substance could be seen to have a greenish hue. "This is what you asked me for," said the Count, "and this is what I promised you." "I thank you from the bottom of my heart," said the young man, taking the spoon from Monte Cristo's hand. The Count took a second spoon and dipped it into the box. "What are you doing?" asked Maximilian, stopping his hand. "God forgive me," said the Count, smiling, "but I think I'm as weary of life as you are, and since the opportunity has presented itself—" "Stop!" cried the young man. "You love and are loved in return. You have faith and hope. Don't do what I'm about to do. That would be a crime. Farewell, noble and generous friend. I'm going to tell Valentine everything you've done for me." Slowly, but without the slightest hesitation, Maximilian swallowed the mysterious substance. Little by little the lamps seemed to grow dim in the hands of the marble statues and the odor of incense became less penetrating. Seated in front of him, Monte Cristo looked at him from the shadows and Maximilian could see nothing of him except his shining eyes. An overwhelming feeling of heaviness took possession of the young man. The objects around him began to lose their shape and color. His troubled eyes seemed to see doors and curtains opening in the walls. "I'm dying, my friend," he said. "Thank you." He tried to hold out his hand to the Count but it fell lifelessly beside him. He rolled over in his armchair as a delicious torpor insinuated itself into all his veins and he felt himself sinking into a vague, dreamy delirium. He tried once again to hold out his hand to the Count, but this time it refused to move at all. He tried to articulate a supreme farewell, but his tongue rolled heavily in his throat like a stone blocking the entrance to a sepulchre. The Count opened a door and Maximilian saw a woman of wondrous beauty appear on the threshold. Pale and gently smiling, she seemed to be the angel of mercy. "Are heaven's gates already opening for me?" thought the dying man. "That angel looks like the one I lost." She walked toward him. "Valentine! Valentine!" cried Maximilian from the depths of his soul. But no sound came from his lips, and, as though all his strength had been gathered into that inner emotion, he heaved a sigh and closed his eyes. Valentine rushed up to him. His lips made one more movement. "He's calling you in his sleep," said the Count. "Death tried to separate you, but happily I was there and I vanquished death. Valentine, you must never leave each other again on this earth," for, in order to find you again, he was ready to plunge into the grave. "Without me, you would both have died. I now give you back to each other. May God take into account these two lives I have saved." Valentine took the Count's hand and, in a surge of irresistible joy, pressed it to her lips. "Oh, thank me," said Monte Cristo. "Tell me again and again that I've made you happy. You can't know how much I need to be certain of that." "Oh, yes, yes. I thank you with all my heart," said Valentine. "If you doubt the sincerity of my thanks, ask Haydée, my precious sister, who made me wait patiently for this day by speaking to me about you from the time we left France together." "Do you love Haydée?" asked Monte Cristo with an emotion which he tried in vain to conceal. "With all my heart." "Then I have a favor to ask of you, Valentine." "Of me? Oh, can I be fortunate enough for that? You called Haydée your sister just now. Let her be your real sister, Valentine. Repay her everything you feel you owe to me. Protect her, you and Maximilian, because—" the Count's voice became almost inaudible. "Because from now on she'll be alone in the world." "Alone in the world?" repeated a voice behind him. "Why?" The Count turned around. Haydée was standing behind him, looking at him with an expression of stupefied amazement. "Because tomorrow you will be free," replied the Count. "Because you will take your proper place in the world. Because I don't want my destiny to darken yours. You're the daughter of a prince. I give you back your father's name and wealth. Haiti turned pale and said in a choked voice, "Then you're leaving me? Haiti! Haiti! You're young, you're beautiful. Forget me and be happy." "Very well," said Haiti, "your orders will be carried out. I will forget you and be happy." She took a step to withdraw. "Oh, my God!" cried Valentine. "Don't you see how pale she is? Don't you understand how she's suffering?" "Why should you expect him to understand that?" said Haiti with a heartbreaking expression. "He's my master and I'm his slave. He has a right not to see anything." The Count trembled at the sound of her voice, which touched the most secret fibers of his heart. "Can what I suspected be true?" he cried. "Haiti, would you be happy to stay with me?" "I'm young," replied Haiti softly. "I love the life you've always made so sweet for me and I'd regret it if I had to die." "Do you mean to say that if I left you, I'd die?" "Yes." "Then you love me?" "Oh, Valentine, he asks if I love him. Tell him if you love Maximilian." The Count felt his heart swell. He opened his arms and Haiti threw herself into them with a cry. "Yes, I love you," she said. "I love you as I love my life, as I love my God, because for me you're the finest, the kindest and the greatest man on this earth." "Let it be as you say, then, my angel," said Monte Cristo. "God, who raised me up against my enemies and made me victorious, didn't want me to have this penance at the end of my victory. I wanted to punish myself, but God wishes to forgive me. Perhaps your love will make me forget what I must forget. One word from you, Haiti, has enlightened me more than 20 years of my slow wisdom. You're all I have left in the world. Through you I attach myself to life again. Through you I can suffer. Through you I can be happy." He stood for a moment in thoughtful silence, then he said, "Have I glimpsed the truth, O God? No matter, whether it be a reward or a punishment, I accept this destiny. Come, Haiti, come." Putting his arm around Haiti's waist, he pressed the hand of Valentine and walked out of the room. An hour passed during which Valentine remained breathlessly at Maximilian's side. Finally she felt his heartbeat and that slight trembling which announces the return of life ran through the young man's body. At length his eyes opened. They stared lifelessly at first, but then his sight came back to him, precise and real. With sight came feeling, and with feeling came pain. "Oh!" he cried in despair. "I'm still alive. The Count deceived me." He picked up a knife from the table. "Wake up, my darling, and look at me," said Valentine with her adorable smile. Maximilian uttered a piercing cry. Doubting his senses, dazzled by what seemed to him a celestial vision, he fell to his knees. The next morning at dawn Maximilian and Valentine were walking arm in arm along the shore. They had found the door of the grotto open and had gone outside. The last stars of the night were still gleaming in the blue morning sky. Suddenly Maximilian noticed a man standing in the shadow of a cluster of large rocks and waiting for a sign to come forward. He pointed out the man to Valentine and said, "It's Jacopo, the captain of the yacht." She beckoned him to approach. "Do you have something to tell us?" asked Maximilian. "The Count told me to give you this letter," replied Jacopo. Maximilian opened the letter and read, "My dear Maximilian, a felucca is now lying at anchor, waiting for you. Jacopo will take you to Leghorn, where Monsieur Noirtier is waiting for his granddaughter, whom he wishes to bless before you lead her to the altar. Everything in this grotto, my house on the Champs-Élysées and my small chateau at Tréport are the wedding present which Edmond Dantes gives to the son of his employer, Monsieur Morel. Tell the angel who will watch over your life to pray now and then for a man who, like Satan, believed himself for an instant to be equal to God, but who realized in all humility that supreme power and wisdom are in the hands of God alone. As for you, Maximilian, here is the secret of my conduct toward you. There is neither happiness nor unhappiness in this world. There is only the comparison of one state with another. Only a man who has felt ultimate despair is capable of feeling ultimate bliss. It is necessary to have wished for death, Maximilian, in order to know how good it is to live. Live, then, and be happy, beloved children of my heart, and never forget that, until the day God deigns to reveal the future to man, the sum of all human wisdom will be contained in these two words: wait and hope. Your friend, Edmond Dante's Count of Monte Cristo. Maximilian looked around him anxiously. The Count's generosity is really excessive, he said. Valentine would have been content with my modest fortune. Where is the Count? Take me to him. Jacopo pointed toward the horizon. What do you mean? Asked Valentine. Where is the Count? Where's Haydée? Look, said Jacopo. The two young people looked in the direction in which he was pointing. On the dark blue line separating the sky from the Mediterranean they saw a white sail. Gone! Cried Maximilian. Farewell, my friend, my father. Gone! Murmured Valentine. Farewell, my friend. Farewell, my sister. Who knows if we'll ever see them again? Said Maximilian. My darling, said Valentine, the Count just told us that all human wisdom was contained in these two words: wait and hope.